In the first part of my talk, I'll be giving you some background to the state of France before the Revolution, and in the second part, we shall deal with the terror. So I should come on time for the second part, which is going to be far more interesting than the first part. I've also added, as we have so many Americans here, a few reflections on American attitudes to the French Revolution, especially that of Thomas Jefferson, which I think you'll find quite interesting. I shan't be criticizing Thomas Jefferson at all, I'm just telling you what he said. So I did feel rather... Any of you who've seen the film The Blues Brothers, when they went to that country music bar, that I'd like to have a kind of cage along here in case all the bottles start flying through the air. I was surprised to hear there are some people who haven't seen The Blues Brothers. Well, anyway, to go back then to 1789, the year the French Revolution began, France was the most populous and prosperous country in Europe. Paris was its largest city. It had a population of 650,000, who were the best educated and most excitable people in the whole of Europe. Despite this prosperity, there was, however, great social inequality in France, and there are many aspects of French life in which reforms, and even drastic reforms, were needed when Louis XVI came to the throne in May 1774. As you probably remember from the Reformation, if the Church had reformed herself in time, the Reformation wouldn't have taken place, and if all the reforms that were needed in France had been implemented before the Revolution, then the Revolution wouldn't have taken place. The French state, as it existed at that time, had developed since the early Middle Ages by a haphazard process of military conquest and dynastic marriages. The independent feudal domains, which had been progressively absorbed into the Kingdom of France, varied in size from the huge province of Brittany to the narrow strip of Flanders. Even the precise number of provinces in pre-revolutionary France is uncertain, but there are at least 39 provincial governorships. In almost every case, all the provinces, however small, have been allowed to keep their local laws and customs. Apart from royal edicts on certain general issues, there are no laws or administrative practices which applied to the entire realm of France. Southern provinces were regulated by written Roman law, but in the Pyrenees, which of course is in the south, local customs reigned supreme. This was also the case in northern France, where there were 65 general customs and 300 local ones. Laws relating to marriage, inheritance, and tenure of property differed in important respects from one district to another. Every district had its own system of weights and measures, but the same name, say for the same weight in one district, the amount you got for that could be different in about 20 different places, so you never knew what you were going to get. And as a result of all these differences, there was an incessant stream of petty litigation in the law courts at the bottom of the vast pyramid of the French legal system. So, as is always everywhere in every country throughout history, pre-revolutionary France was a great place to be a lawyer, because you always had plenty of work. Now, the tax system also was far from uniform and far from fair. The main direct tax, called the tire, was levied on persons in some provinces and on land in other provinces. Those in the north bore a much heavier tax burden than those in the south. There was a salt tax, the notorious gabelle, and that was levied at 6 different rates throughout the kingdom, while 6 districts, including the vast province of Brittany, didn't pay it at all. Taxes were not paid directly to the government, but were farmed out to some of the wealthiest men in France, who were called the farmers general, and a large proportion of the royal revenue is deducted to increase the wealth of the farmers and build their beautiful chateau on the Loire. A tour of the chateau on the Loire is a well-worth holiday, by the way. Almost every aspect of life in France involving finance was farmed out for ready cash. These were known as venal offices, of which I'll say a little more later. The office was sold, the royal treasury received the ready cash, and then the purchaser of the office needed to recoup his initial outlay and make an income for himself. Venal offices provided incomes for an army of bureaucrats who were referred to as leeches of the poor. The most hated leech, of course, being the tax collector. Because in the time of our Lord, with the Romans, as you know, they farmed out the taxes to tax collectors, which is why tax collectors were hated then. I suppose the same in every country and every time. So these farmers general, they employed a host of mini-leeches to collect the money for them, and each mini-leech had to take his cut. The entire country was crisscrossed with an internal system of customs barriers at the gates of towns, along rivers, or between provinces. The rate of tax on a limitless range of items differed from district to district. To give just one example, if you wanted to ship goods down the rivers Saône and the Rhône from Franche-Comté to the Mediterranean, you had to pay duty at 36 public and private customs barriers. So it's hardly surprising that smuggling was a very, very popular industry. In France, there were 13 parliaments or sovereign courts of appeal, and they all guarded their ancient privileges fiercely. The Parlement of Paris was the largest, and it had jurisdiction over a third of France. There were even areas of France that didn't come under the jurisdiction of the king. Avignon, the surrounding area, belonged to the Pope. Parts of Alsace came under the sovereignty of German princes, and there was even an independent city-state called Mulhouse. What I'm going to say now is very important to understand France before the Revolution, and that is that peasants accounted for 80% of the French population. Now, I believe in France today they have the highest proportion of peasants or small farmers in the whole of Europe. So only 1/5 of Louis XVI's subjects actually lived in communities of more than 2,000 people. French peasants were actually better off than their counterparts anywhere in Europe, except perhaps those of northern Italy. But their prosperity depended entirely on good harvests, and a bad harvest, let alone a series of them, could reduce vast numbers of peasants to abject poverty. Bad harvests also resulted in food shortages and high prices in the large towns and cities, and almost invariably in riots, above all in Paris. Paris is famous for its rioting. Bread made up 3/4 of the ordinary people's diet, so French cooking wasn't always terribly exciting, I wouldn't think. There were very serious riots in 1775, just before the coronation of Louis XVI, and they were set off by a rise of more than 50% in the price of bread. These riots, actually, they're referred to as the Flour War. I believe sometime in America you had a whiskey war, which sounds far more interesting. I think whiskey might be worth fighting over, but not flour. But anyway, this flour war required the intervention of the army, hundreds of arrests, 2 public executions, and the imposition of strict price controls to restore order. In 1778, the southern cities of Grenoble, Toulouse, and Bordeaux were scenes of serious rioting after harvest shortfalls. Some of the principal complaints concerning the old regime had been rectified during the reign of Louis XVI, who was a very, very considerate king who loved his people dearly, and his first concern was for their welfare. But he was also weak and vacillating when faced with a crisis. The king had abolished one of the most hated taxes. Well, it wasn't a tax, it was compulsory labour. It was called the corvée, and peasants were, as a condition of living on the land which belonged to their feudal overlords, had to build roads and repair roads, and they didn't like doing that. That had been abolished. Serfs had been liberated. Almost up to that time there were still serfs in France. Torture to obtain confessions had been prohibited. The medieval guild system, which some people found far too restrictive because it made it hard to get into certain professions, that had been abolished. Jews were freed of discriminatory taxes. Must have made them very happy. More foundling homes and schools for blind and deaf-mute children were established. Protestants were emancipated from all discriminatory laws in 1797. Actually, and that was to the outrage of the faithful in the Catholic districts of France. Louis also realized the pressing need for tax reforms in the interest of his poorest subjects. The taxes of the poorest part of our subjects have increased in proportion, much more than all the rest, he insisted. The king hoped that rich people will not think themselves wronged when they will have to meet other charges which long since they should have shared with the poor. The king established pawn shops to lend money to the poor at 3%. He also proposed to abolish the dungeons at Vincennes and to raise the Bastille to the ground as part of a program of prison reform. The most evident social phenomenon at the time of the accession of Louis XVI was the rise of the bourgeoisie. The privileged classes in France seldom made up more than 1/5 of the population of any town. Only the town, not the country. For the country as a whole, it was a much smaller population. Their income and their lifestyle were far beyond the dreams of the ordinary Frenchman. With the exception of a few master craftsmen, they did not work with their hands. There were about 2.75 million members of this privileged class, and all of them, but for a few 100,000 nobles and clerics, were members of the bourgeoisie. Members of this class were certainly the least religious section of Catholic France. They'd all been indoctrinated with the Enlightenment. With their superior education obtained in Catholic schools and their great wealth, they thanked the God in whom they did not believe that they were not as other men. They were indifferent or even hostile to organized religion, and they looked upon the ordinary clergy in particular with amused contempt. They believed that the past had bequeathed a huge mass of ignorance, prejudice, and superstition which enlightened men had a duty to eradicate. Avid disciples of Rousseau, the philosophe, and Voltaire, they preferred to be guided by science and philosophy rather than religion. And what religion they professed was deist rather than Catholic. The encyclopedia was their catechism. C.C. O'Brien writes, the court was officially Christian, specifically Catholic, while the staple activity of the philosophes was ridiculing Catholicism in the mode of their archetype and exemplar Voltaire. They were highly influential and uniformly well disposed towards the United States, partly because of its exemplary lack of a church establishment. Between the reign of Louis XIV, who died in 1714, and the accession of Louis XVI, the number of bourgeoisie increased threefold, while the population as a whole grew only by a quarter. Their share of the national wealth was enormous. Most industrial and almost all commercial capital was bourgeois owned, and they bought up a quarter of the land. The source of bourgeois enrichment was the extraordinary commercial and industrial expansion of 18th century France. Industry and trade were flourishing in France as never before, and the revolution was to prove a great setback in this field, as would also be the case with the Russian Revolution of 1917. So you know, before the Russian Revolution of 1917, Russia exported corn to the whole of Europe. It was called the Granary of Europe, and it's still having now to buy corn from the United States. Simon Schama, in his book Citizens, and if you want to get a book on the revolution, that's really one to begin with, Simon Schama's book Citizens, or William Doyle's Oxford History of the French Revolution. So Simon Schama says, the old regime then was not a society doddering on its way to the grave. Far from appearing moribund, signs of dynamism and energy may be found wherever the historian looks. Despite their supposed devotion to philosophy and science, the bourgeoisie were motivated by two principal preoccupations, one might even say obsessions. The first was to increase their wealth, particularly by buying government stock, and the acquisition of more and more land, both for its intrinsic value and for the social prestige that it imparted. Their second preoccupation was the acquisition of noble status. Their relationship with the aristocracy was certainly one of love-hate. They despised the nobles as social parasites, but wished to become nobles themselves. The best method of attaining this end was to obtain an ennobling office. The French is to be anobli. This was a public office which conferred automatic nobility on the man appointed to it. And how did one obtain such offices? The answer is that one purchased them, hence the term venal offices. Selling public offices had become an essential source of revenue for the French crown, and there were at least 50,000 of them during the reign of Louis XVI. Once an office had been purchased, it could, by payment of an annual tax, be passed on to the heirs of the office holder or resold to a third party. The insatiable desire of the bourgeoisie to obtain these offices made them an excellent financial investment, and the price of these offices rocketed up in the decades prior to the Revolution. Only 3,700 of these offices conferred automatic nobility, and in most cases they needed to be held by the same family for 2 generations before the noble title could be inherited. One very interesting office was that of the King's Secretary. If you became the King's Secretary, you were ennobled immediately and completely, and being the King's Secretary involved no duties whatsoever. You didn't have to do anything. You just paid a vast sum of money to become the King's Secretary, and the King had 819 secretaries who did nothing at all, but all became nobles automatically as a result of obtaining this position. This office was despised by the ancient and hereditary aristocracy. They really looked down on these bourgeois parvenus, and they called these offices soap for scum, savonnette à vilain in French. Through the purchase of venal offices and other avenues for entering the noble state, about 7,000 people left the bourgeoisie for the nobility during the 18th century, which, with their families, amounted to a total of about 40,000 new members of the aristocracy. It has been estimated that at least a quarter of the French nobility in 1789 had been ennobled since the beginning of the century, indicating that the nobility was an open elite and not a hereditary caste apart from the rest of the people. The ancient noble families considered that the essence of nobility lay in the fact that it was hereditary, passed on from fathers to their children in the blood. The true nobility, they believed, were those whose lineage was lost in the mists of time. Those who were ennobled, they said, could ape them, but they could never really join them. There was a distinct lack of logic in this attitude, as the conferring of nobility was a prerogative of the king. No matter how far back you went in the midst of time, a noble title had originally been conferred by the king. And by more or less denying the king's right to confer nobility upon the bourgeoisie, the ancient families were really denying the king one of his highest prerogatives. On the other hand, I can see that it seems reasonable to make a distinction between a title that had been awarded to reward some glorious deed of chivalry in the service of France and one which had been purchased at what amounts virtually to an auction. The principal objective of the bourgeoisie in obtaining nobility was the acquisition of social prestige, even though they knew very well that they were despised by the hereditary nobility unless they happened to have a daughter who had a huge dowry attached to her. And the hereditary nobility were always very, very anxious to snap up these daughters. And they used to call it to re-gild their arms, to bring in some money. In his History of the Revolution, William Doyle writes, "Nobility was a club which every wealthy man felt entitled, indeed obliged to join. Not all nobles by any means were rich, but sooner or later all the rich ended up noble." What were the benefits of nobility apart from the social prestige? They formed a social estate or order in society, and they looked down upon all who were not noble as commoners, roturiers in French. All the king's ministers were noble, and the royal court was peopled exclusively by nobles. Nobles took precedence on public occasions, they carried swords, and they had coats of arms. They could be tried only in special courts. They didn't go in the same courts as the ordinary people. And they had some wonderful privileges. One of the privileges they had, that if they were going to be executed, they could only be decapitated, which must have been very, very comforting. Troops could not be billeted upon nobles. They could not be conscripted into the militia, and they were exempt from the hated gabelle, the salt tax. And above all, they were exempted from paying the tire, the basic tax. The privilege of not paying tax dated right back to the Middle Ages, when every nobleman was obliged to risk his life in the service of his country, and they weren't expected to contribute money as well. Well, at the time, that sounded quite reasonable. There is no exact information on the number of hereditary nobles. Estimates range from 120,000 to 350,000. They owned about a quarter of the land in France, which was a proportion already equalled by the bourgeoisie, but they also possessed feudal rights over their tenants. Commissions in the army were restricted to nobles. You could never be an officer in the army unless you were a noble. And they could be purchased. So you could purchase a commission in the army. You couldn't in the navy, because in the navy, which Mr. Fallon will confirm, being a sailor himself, in the navy your prime quality needed is skill and ability. So if you didn't know what you were doing, you could crash a ship into the rocks or sink it. So in the Navy, you got on in the Navy by ability. But anyway, very few hereditary nobles wanted to join the Navy because it wasn't a terribly pleasant life in those days, even for officers. There's a popular prejudice that the numerically insignificant nobility possessed all the political power in France. This had ceased to be true long before the Revolution. Louis XIV had initiated a very successful policy of concentrating most of the more powerful nobles of France at Versailles, bestowing artificial offices upon them and absorbing them completely in the complex and often ludicrous etiquette of court life. thus taming and domesticating the higher nobility who had previously presented the most serious threat to the royal authority. The effective government of France was not in the hands of the nobility, but in the hands of a plutocracy in which the majority of nobles had no share at all. There's been no more accurate description of what took place during the French Revolution than that of the historian F.E. Grunfeld, who writes, "The French Revolution, therefore, was the essentially chaotic and often violent process by which political power passed into the hands of those who already possessed economic power. In the words of one economic historian, it made the bourgeoisie the masters of the world." The classic medieval division of society was into those who worked, those who fought, and those who prayed. Having discussed the first two classes on the eve of the revolution, it's necessary to examine the third, those who prayed. In law, the clergy ranked ahead of the nobility as the first estate of the realm, the custodians of its spiritual welfare and moral standards. The liberal view of the church in pre-revolutionary France is of an institution pervaded by ignorance and decadence. On the contrary, the ordinary French clergy were as a whole devout and dedicated to their parishioners, by whom they were loved. One of the greatest of all French historians, Alexis de Tocqueville, wrote, "I am not sure whether, despite the faults of certain of its members, there was ever a clergy more remarkable than the French at the moment of being engulfed by the Revolution, more enlightened, more national, less limited in the performance of private virtue, or better imbued with public morality and religious faith. There was approximately one curé for every 400 inhabitants, and in the countryside he was almost invariably the only cleric ever seen by the peasants. In the towns there were cathedrals, collegiate churches, convents, hospitals, schools, and innumerable parishes, often in sight of each other. Education, care of the sick, and care of the poor were undertaken almost exclusively by the church, which owned about 1/10 of the land in France, and this brought in a vast income. All church income was exempt from taxation, but every 10 years a very large free gift was contributed to the royal revenue. This was raised by an internal levy on clerical income, of which the parish clergy were most unfairly compelled to pay half, which not surprisingly caused considerable resentment. The parish clergy were, in theory, entitled to 1/10 of their livelihood in cash or in kind from every member of their parishes. Many parishioners, however, managed to avoid paying this altogether, and even those who did pay very rarely handed over the whole 1/10. So the ordinary clergy, they wished ecclesiastical revenues to be more equitably distributed, and they wanted the wealth of bishops reduced, and parish priests to be assured of a decent salary. Since the Concordat of 1516 between Francis I and Pope Leo X, the king appointed the bishops and the abbots of the greater monasteries. Bishops were chosen exclusively from the ranks of the aristocracy, so if you're an ordinary person, you never had any hope of ever becoming a bishop. And they were usually the younger sons who often had no true vocation and for whom the office was seen solely as a means of providing an income. The notorious Maurice Talleyrand-Périgord is the most evident example of such a prelate. I wish I had time to talk to you about him. A wealthy bishop might have an income of 50,000 livres a year, while a poor country curé might have to subsist on as little as 300, although the average income for a curé was the very low sum of 700 livres. Even unskilled labourers earn more than this. And the parish clergy didn't come from the peasants, the poor. They came from the bourgeoisie. They were educated. You had to be educated to become a priest, which shows, just be careful about your passing generalizations that all the bourgeoisie were infected with the Enlightenment. So these were good holy men who accepted a life in which they're going to have a very, very low salary, purely for love of God and love of the people. And quite reasonably they resented the fact that a bishop who probably rarely appeared in his diocese and had got the position simply because he was a noble was getting 50,000 livres a year. Well, they got 700. There were other amply justified demands for reforms in the church. More schools needed to be established and depopulated abbeys to be closed. And monks and abbots and monks were supposed to be compelled to live in accordance with their rules, which very often they weren't doing. In the vast majority of monastic communities, the abbots were not residents, but appointed in commendam by the king. Our friend Mary here has written a very excellent study of the French monasteries, which really ought to be published. What that means is the king would appoint an abbot who wasn't necessarily even in the religious life. Could be one of the king's relations or the son of some member of the court, and he would get all the income that came to the abbey, and they'd appoint someone to carry out the duties in the abbey itself. And the people in the abbey would have to live on a very small income. And this wasn't something abnormal. There are 755 monasteries in France, and only 130 of them were outside this system. Only 130 of them actually had abbots who were members of the community living in the abbey. The situation with convents was very, very different. When Dr. von Hildebrand gave her talk, I was very pleased the way she drew our attention to the fact that there were, say, the Visitandines in France. Was it 90? 80 of these convents all over France, filled by devout young girls who loved God and loved the poor and were entirely dedicated to their religion. So the situation among the female religious was very different than that of the men. Henri Daniel Rops, he's written a wonderful history of this period. Well, in fact, he's written a whole history of the church. But he comments that most demands from reform within the church were very reasonable. Frenchmen, he said, desired indeed to reorganize their church, but they had no wish to destroy it. The starting point for the French Revolution was the convocation of the Estates General by King Louis XVI. This ancient national representative body had not been called since 1614, and the extent of its authority was far from clear. All that was certain was that the king needed its approval for the raising of new taxes, and an immediate and considerable increase in revenue had become a pressing need for the royal treasury, which became bankrupt on the 16th of August 1788. The reason it became bankrupt was there was a financial crisis triggered off by France's costly participation in the American Revolution. Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, or Turgot perhaps, had been appointed the Comptroller General of Finance by Louis XVI soon after his accession. He began to introduce widespread reforms, and he actually reduced public expenditure and increased public revenue without increasing taxation. He established free trading grain throughout France and began to remove the fiscal barriers between provinces. His mistake was to try to abolish the immunity from taxation enjoyed by the aristocrats, who not surprisingly put pressure on the king to dismiss Turgot, and not surprisingly the king did so because he lived in Versailles surrounded by no one but aristocrats, and was probably making his life a misery, rather like if any married man ever wants to do something his wife doesn't want him to do, and in the end you succumb to the pressure. So anyway, the king succumbed to the pressure and dismissed poor Turgot. Before his dismissal, he warned the king that the proposal of the foreign minister, Charles Gravier Vergennes, to intervene in the American Revolution would be a disaster for France. Turgot told the king that it would permanently destroy all hope of financial reform and would not necessarily weaken the military and economic power of Great Britain, and he proved to be right in both respects. The decision to intervene in the transatlantic revolution was, I presume everybody realized, on the part of the French, it wasn't for any great love for the Americans. It was a straightforward act of revenge, as is made clear by the Welsh historian Gwyn Lewis. Lewis says, as a result of the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63, Great Britain asserted her superiority over France as a world power. French influence had been swept out of Canada, effectively undermined in India, and challenged in the West Indies. From 1763 to the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, the bitter pill of defeat stuck in French throats, helping to explain their misguided and financially ruinous foreign policy, including the bizarre decision to send soldiers of the absolute French monarch to assist Republican American colonists in their war of independence against Great Britain. Turgot was succeeded by Jacques Necker, who became director of the Treasury from 1777 to 1781. Necker also warned that the transatlantic intervention would bankrupt the country, but his advice went unheeded. Necker was a unique figure in pre-revolutionary France. He was a Swiss-born Protestant financier who wasn't an aristocrat, and he was highly competent, he was completely incorruptible, and he was totally loyal to the king. And as I said, his position was unique, but he had to be called the treasury because he was a Protestant. He couldn't become Comptroller General. In theory, to be a minister in the French government, you had to be an aristocrat and a Catholic. Necker described the French taxation system in which the key offices were optioned as a real monstrosity in the eyes of reason. As a result of vehement opposition from the nobility and bourgeoisie to any increase in taxation to finance the war, Necker had been forced to do so by borrowing. The day would come when these loans would have to be repaid, but there would be no funds with which to repay them. Altogether, the American involvement cost the French state over 1 billion livres. It was the French fleet and the battalions of Lafayette and Rochambeau, who were both prominent members of Masonic lodges, that helped Washington to bottle up Cornwallis in Yorktown, compelling him to surrender and so bring the war to a close. This is rather interesting. After the defeat of Cornwallis, those French, American and British officers who were members of Masonic lodges dined together, despite having fought on opposite sides. Revolutionary ideas, which were already well established in France as a result of the Enlightenment, then swept across the Atlantic from America into France, brought back by returning French officers like Lafayette, and they reinforced the strong hold which such ideas already had on the ruling elites of the kingdom. Between 800 and 900 Masonic lodges had been founded in France between 1732 and 1793. Two-thirds of them were founded after 1760. Between 1773 and 1779, well over 20,000 members were recruited. Few towns of any consequence were without one or more lodges by the 1780s, and despite several papal condemnations of this deistic cult which had originated in Protestant England, the elite of society flocked to join. Voltaire was drafted in on his last visit to Paris, and it was before the assembled brethren of the Nine Sisters Lodge that he exchanged his symbolic embrace with Franklin. I thought perhaps we could reenact that today, but I needed a tubby man with long hair to do Franklin, so we had to pass over that. So the royal treasury was now completely crippled by this unnecessary war debt, and Necker was dismissed in 1781. He got the blame for the bankruptcy, despite the fact that it was caused by not following his advice. And it's ironic to reflect on the fact that Catholic France was overthrown and its most Christian king guillotined because he failed to accept the advice of a Swiss Protestant commoner. The only solution to the financial crisis seemed to be the calling of the Estates General, because the king needed, he just absolutely had to raise new taxes, and he couldn't do so without the help of the Estates General. And he hoped devoutly that the estates would come to the aid of his bankrupt exchequer by raising the new taxes, and they were formally summoned in August 1788. But the circumstances in which they were to meet could hardly have been less propitious. Poor King Louis could have complained, as did Hamlet, how all occasions do inform against me. I've already explained that nothing was more disastrous than for the French economy than bad harvests. And perhaps Father Breyer could explain to us how often God doesn't seem to help the good guys. You remember King David in the Psalms keeps saying, "How long, O Lord, how long?" And it seems that before the revolution, God was doing everything he could to undermine the king. The year 1788 was marked by merciless acts of God. A severe drought stunted the crops. A hailstorm raged from Normandy to Champagne, and it devastated 180 miles of usually fertile terrain. The winter, 1788 to 1789, was the severest in 80 years. Fruit trees perished by the thousands. The spring of 1789 loosed disastrous floods. The summer brought famine to almost every province. State, church and private charity strove to get food to the starving. Only a few individuals actually died of hunger, but millions came close to the end of their resources. Caen, Rouen, Orléans, Nancy and Lyon saw rival groups fighting like animals in the streets for corn. Marseille saw 8,000 famished people at its gates, threatening to invade and pillage the city. In Paris, in the working-class district of Saint-Antoine, there were 30,000 paupers to be cared for. So properly speaking then, the crisis of 1789 began in 1788, and the symptoms of agrarian distress endured until the early months of 1790, and later still in the southwest, where the barely adequate harvest of 1789 succeeded in containing the situation, but did little more. There was thus hardship, unrest, and anxiety in urban and rural France when the estates assembled at Versailles on the 5th of May 1789. Gwyn Lewis comments, economic recession and harvest failure transformed a political crisis into social revolution. That's why I was saying it's a pity God couldn't have given a little help to the good guys, but there we are. I'm sure Father Brera can give us a reason why this sort of thing happens. So, yes, the first and second estates represented the clergy and the nobility, as I've already told you. The third estate, of whom 2/3 had a legal qualification, represented the rest of French society. So you can see there's trouble in store when 2/3 of the third estate are lawyers. But these people represented the whole of the rest of France, but those who were eligible to vote and to join this elite, they represented only a very small propertied bourgeois minority, which embodied everything represented in all the key areas of French business and professional activity. On the 27th of December 1788, the third estate had been permitted as many members as the two other estates combined. So there you've got the third estate is equal in numbers to the other two estates, and 2/3 of the third estate are lawyers. In a letter to Washington, Thomas Jefferson expressed great hopes as to what the convocation of the estates would achieve. In every event, he wrote, I think the present disquiet will end well. The nation has been awakened by our revolution. They feel their strength. They are enlightened. Their lights are spreading, and they will not retrograde. Jefferson maintained consistently that the French Revolution was a continuation and fulfillment of the American one, both revolutions being manifestations of one and the same spirit of liberty. Although the opening of the Estates General at Versailles on the 4th of May 1789 could hardly have come at a more inauspicious moment, no event appeared less likely to lead to a revolution. I'd like to read you the very lovely description written by Daniel Watts of the opening of the Estates General, which was really the opening of the French Revolution. You see, the general impression among people is the French Revolution was a spontaneous rising of poor, starving, hungry peasants. You rose up spontaneously and overthrew through the evil king and nobles. This is how the French Revolution began. As the doors of the Church of Notre Dame at Versailles swing open, the voice of an organ reaches the expectant crowds. Led by a cross-bearer, the procession comes into view. First to appear are hundreds of men dressed in sober black and small tricorn hats. Next, far more elegant, members of the nobility in black and white satin embroidered with gold, their plumed headgear stirring in the breeze. Behind them walk a small group of bishops and cardinals, resplendent in violet and purple, followed by two long files of cassocked priests. Each carries a candle in his right hand. Then, beneath a cloth of gold canopy, the Archbishop of Paris bears the Blessed Sacrament in a monstrance, flashing like the sun. Immediately after him steps the king, wearing his great coronation mantle of blue, adorned with golden fleur-de-lis. He is attended by the Queen, the princes and princesses of the blood, and senior officers of the orders of chivalry. That slow cortege takes more than an hour to reach its destination, the Church of St. Louis. Every building along the route has hung out some piece of gorgeous tapestry, and the pavements are crowded with a throng of people held back by an unbroken line of troops. The three estates of the most Christian realm are on their way to attend a Mass of the Holy Ghost, begging God to enlighten the deliberations of the States General, which are to open on the following day. Thus, with the full splendor of the Catholic liturgy was initiated a train of events which for a time would appear to have obliterated Catholicism from the most Christian realm of France. There is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that an organized conspiracy within the Third Estate existed to overthrow, alter, and throne. There's some people here might disagree with me there, and perhaps we'll have a chance to discuss that later. When the estates assembled, not one of them had the least thought of establishing a republic. Before the estates met, in what may well have been the most widespread consultation of public opinion in world history up to that point, Every Frenchman, rich and poor alike, humble peasant and artisan to the great nobles, were permitted to express their concerns in what were termed cahiers de doléances, books of complaints, which those who represented them were required to put forward when the estates opened. Where these books are concerned, nearly all declared themselves in favour of the king and the maintenance of the monarchy. The poorest people, in fact, were expressing their confidence in these books. They said what their complaints were, and then they said how confident they were that the good king would put these things right for them. And the cahiers of the clergy concentrated on the just grievances of the ordinary curate, to which I've already referred. They asked for higher stipends, access to diocesan administration posts, canonries, bishoprics, and for a church government elected by synods. That the ordinary clergy who made these demands were in no way tainted by political or theological liberalism is made quite clear by the unanimity of the First Estate, that's the clergy, on the need to retain and increase the Church's control over education, to maintain censorship against the impieties of the Enlightenment, and to restrict the toleration accorded to the Protestants. There's not one expression coming from a priest at any level that the Protestants should continue to be tolerated, or the toleration increased. Of the 303 deputies elected to represent the clergy, over two-thirds were ordinary parish priests, only 50 were bishops, and only 23 represented the monasteries. The Second Estate, the nobility, were actually prepared to make concessions, and there was virtual unanimity among them that they should give up all fiscal privileges and pay taxes the same as everyone else. As a group, the Second Estate, though, the nobility, they were far less unified and far less organised than the First and Third Estates. So the clergy and the bourgeoisie were the best organised. The Third Estate, the bourgeoisie, advocated the continuance of a constitutional monarchy, as did a majority of the parish clergy. The periodical convocation of the Estates General, the supremacy in financial matters, the responsibility of ministers, and the regular guarantee of individual liberty. William Doyle in his Oxford History of the Revolution says this, hardly anybody, and certainly not the philosophes, dreamed of revolution or would even have understood the idea. Certainly they advocated a change in outlook, a way of looking at the world, less dependent upon religion and tradition. There's another history of the revolution written by a man called Forrest, and he says, the dominant figures of the Third Estates during the summer months of 1789 were almost all committed monarchists. Men like Mounier, Lally, Tollendal, Berjas, and Clermont-Tonnerre, who wished to prevent any overt attack upon the executive power of the king. They were the men who were in charge of the drive for constitutional reform, and they would dominate the constitutional committee established by the National Assembly. The cause of reform, it seemed, was safe in their hands. The perils of revolution safely averted. It reminds me of the Second Vatican Council, because hardly any of the bishops who arrived there thought for one moment of initiating a revolution in the church. Just as there was no suggestion of overthrowing the monarchy, there was no suggestion of depriving Catholicism of its status as the religion of the realm. The more radical, Masonic and philosoph-inspired members of the Third Estate hoped to undermine the authority of throne and altar as far as they possibly could, and to extend the influence of their own ideas and obtain as much political power as possible. But I'll repeat again, as far as I've been able to find it out, in my research, I can't find any organised conspiracy to overthrow the King of the Church. Some people would certainly disagree with that. Some people would believe there was a long-plotted Masonic conspiracy to do this. The first revolutionary gesture, in the formal sense, that of a defiance of the King's authority, took place on the 17th of June, 1789. The Third Estate, which, as I've said, was dominated by bourgeoisie, full of Enlightenment ideas, they didn't just want, they declared that they alone were the National Assembly, and later on they changed this to call themselves a Constituent Assembly, and eventually the Legislative Assembly. They insisted that all three estates should meet as one, which, as they had as many members as the other two estates put together, it meant that they would run the whole thing. On the 19th of June, the majority of the clergy accepted an invitation to join the National Assembly, because I've explained to you, the ordinary clergy had very just demands to make, and they thought the best way to get them would be allying themselves with the Third Estate. The next day, the rooms in which the estates were to meet were locked and guarded by soldiers. The king said, no, this isn't going to happen. We're going to follow what amounted to the French Constitution. Each estate will meet separately. The third estate was outraged by what it called this act of despotism and adjourned to a nearby indoor tennis court where, in a very melodramatic atmosphere, they swore the famous tennis court's oath, never to disperse until the constitution of the realm and public regeneration are established and assured. And there are lots of paintings of this, rather musically, they're all making very melodramatic gestures. King Louis XVI refused at first to capitulate, and he ordered the estates to continue to meet separately. But then he capitulated to the fait accompli, and on the 27th of June, he ordered the first two estates to unite the third as the National Assembly. This was the first and fatal error of judgment on the king's part. He had surrendered to what could only be described as a revolutionary demand. And in any revolution, the first surrender leads to further and more radical demands. On the 11th of July, Thomas Jefferson sent a glowing account of the triumph of what can rightly be described as the French Revolution to his English friend Thomas Paine. The National Assembly then, for that is the name they take, having shown through every stage of these transactions a coolness, wisdom, and resolution to set fire to the four corners of the kingdom, and to perish with it themselves, rather than to relinquish an iota from their plan of a total change of government, are now in complete and undisputed possession of the sovereignty. On the 14th of July, 1789, the Bastille was taken by a mob of gullible citizens stirred up by a group of revolutionary agitators. Well, I think this must be one of those pathetic events in European history. It was supposed to be packed out with your prisoners put there by the evil king, and all they could find in there were 4 criminals and 3 lunatics. And they were liberated. And to celebrate that, the French now have a national day. It's more accurate to speak of a series of revolutions than a single revolution. One faction after another would take control, new leaders would emerge, and their predecessors would frequently meet their own on the guillotine. Effective power belonged to those who could control or manipulate the notorious Paris mob. These are the people called sans-culottes. The upper-class people in France wore knee breeches, which were called culottes, and stockings. But the workers wore ankle-length pantaloons, the sort of thing Bill is wearing, if you want to know what a sans-culotte would be dressed in. So they were called... have you got them on today, Bill? The ones with the stripes. Yeah. That's it. Yeah, that? Yeah. So they wore ankle-length pantaloons like that, and then hence they were without culottes, so they're called sans-culottes. Mob violence had long been a feature of parish life, and on such occasions as food shortages or price increases, the sans-culotte would rise up. The power of the sans-culotte, manipulated by the skilled agitators of the revolution, was manifested in October when a mob composed predominantly of women marched from Paris to Versailles and invaded both the National Assembly and the Royal Palace, demanding that King and Assembly should comply with the demand that they chanted incessantly, "To Paris, to Paris." Both the King and the Assembly capitulated to the mob and moved to Paris, where the King and Queen remained until their executions, except for a brief escape to Varennes, which I won't have time to talk about. These, in the revolutionary mythology, these are the legendary October days. In the following year, 1790, Edmund Burke described the abduction of the royal family with a revulsion that must have been felt by anyone possessing even a vestige of civilized, let alone Christian sentiment. This is what Edmund Burke says in his reflections on the French Revolution. This king, to say no more of him, and this queen and their infant children, who once would have been the pride and hope of a generous people, were then forced to abandon the sanctuary of the most splendid palace in the world, which they left swimming in blood, polluted by massacre, and strewed with the scattered limbs and mutilated carcasses. Thence they were conducted into the capital of their kingdom. 2 had been selected from the unprovoked, unresisted, promiscuous slaughter which was made of the gentlemen of birth and family who composed the king's bodyguard. These 2 gentlemen, with all the parade of an execution of justice, were cruelly and publicly dragged to the block and beheaded in the great court of the palace. Their heads were stuck upon spears and led the procession, while the royal captives who followed in the train were slowly moved along amidst the horrid yells and shrilling screams and frantic dances and infamous contumelies and all the unutterable abominations of the furies of hell in the abused shape of the vilest of women. Sounds like a description of the feminist movement, but still. After they had been made to taste, drop by drop, more than the bitterness of death, in the slow torture of a journey of 12 miles, protracted to 6 hours, they were under a guard composed of those very soldiers who thus conducted them through this famous triumph, lodged in one of the old palaces of Paris, now converted into a Bastille for kings. In his history of the Revolution, William Doyle notes that the central authorities of the regenerate French state were now at the mercy of Paris, and time and again over the next 5 years Parisians would intervene in national politics in the role of the self-appointed watchdog of the Revolution. There were periods when it can be claimed without exaggeration that those who controlled the Paris mob controlled France, due to the extent that the mob could intimidate the assembly. William Doyle remarks that in 1793, power now lay not with the Assembly, but with the new Paris Commune. This was greatly resented by the inhabitants of great cities such as Marseille, Lyon, Toulon and Bordeaux, who eventually took up arms to defend their interests in what was to be known as the Federalist movement. Their feelings were expressed by Jean-Baptiste Birotteau, the deputy for the Pyrénées-Orientales, when he stated in June 1793, "Anarchy has set up its throne in Paris. It reigns there by the use of terror, and its aim is to enslave the whole of France." How much more have I got now?
You've got about 8 minutes.
Oh, good, right. So now we're coming to the Declaration of the Rights of Man. On the 26th of August, 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Man was promulgated. It was an explicit repudiation of the kingship of Christ. The French Masons actually boasted of the fact that the Declaration had originated in their lodges. The committee which drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man included the Marquis de Lafayette, who had achieved fame in the American Revolutionary War and was a prominent Mason. Lafayette's wife, Adrienne, embroidered a Masonic apron for Washington, and Washington wore this apron when he presided over the supreme Masonic act of laying the foundation stone of the Capitol. So now when you see that stone, you can mention to people, oh, did you know the apron Washington wore was embroidered by Lafayette's wife Adrienne? You see, a lot of people don't know that. Anyway, Thomas Jefferson had been the minister plenipotentiary of the United States in Paris in the 1780s, and he played an important part in the drafting of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, using experience gained in drafting the Declaration of Independence. He was appointed Minister of State by Washington and returned to the USA in the same year. William Doyle laid stress on the great admiration for the United States among members of the Enlightenment. No doubt the original sympathy of the French government for the American cause, like the eagerness of their government to give encouragement and help the rebels, sprang from the desire to be revenged on the British for the humiliations of the 7 Years' War. By the time a formal alliance was struck between France and the United States, however, French interest in America had passed far beyond the desire to spite the British. People had begun to see in America all their dreams come true, a simpler, healthier, more virtuous society established in a virgin land of limitless possibilities, a new nation constituting itself from first principles. Much of what Frenchmen thought they saw in America bore little enough resemblance to reality, but the message was nonetheless powerful for all that. Enthusiasm for all things American engulfed the country. Benjamin Franklin, the American ambassador, and the very embodiment of the new nation's simple virtues, became the most sought-after man in Parisian society. The public was deluged with writings on all aspects of America and showed an insatiable appetite for more. America showed that new starts could be made, that it was possible to renounce a whole order and set up a new and improved one, that piecemeal reform was not the only road to improvement. It offered the prospect, hitherto merely a matter for theoretical speculation, of a nation establishing itself on the principle that the people were the ultimate sovereign power, which, as I learnt with great interest from David White a few days ago, was a principle put forward by John Milton. Now, this principle that the people are the ultimate sovereign power is the heresy that forms the basis of all the evils of the modern age. It claims, and this is very, very important, it claims that as legislators are elected by the people, they govern in the name of the people and as delegates of the people. From a Catholic standpoint, nothing could be more false. This is an error that tears God down from his throne and replaces him with man. It's an error which has since spread throughout the whole world and is taken for granted today by almost every citizen of every country, including Catholics, including most of the Catholic clergy. On the contrary, God is the sole source of all authority. Authority in the family, authority in the church, and in the state. When Pilate informed our Lord that he possessed the authority to crucify or release him, our Lord replied, "Thou shouldst not have any power against me unless it was given to thee from above." Those invested with authority in the state are obliged to govern not as delegates of the people, but as legates of God. The theory that the people are the ultimate source of authority has given rise to that concept of democracy condemned consistently and unequivocally by the popes. Now, the Church is not opposed to democracy if all that is meant by that is that legislators are elected by a ballot based on universal suffrage. What it cannot accept is that once elected, legislators govern as delegates of the people and have a mandate to legislate in accordance with the will of the majority. This evil concept destroys the basis of any objective standards of morality. In fact, this evil concept can be summed up in 3 words: we the people. Satan said the same thing in 2 words: non serviam, I will not serve. What is right and what is wrong are no longer decided by the immutable word of God, but by what the people feel is a good idea at any particular moment. Henri Daniel Roth's remarks, considering the members of the committee that drafted the Declaration, all were strongly tainted with a philosophical spirit, that same spirit which in 1776 had inspired the Constitution of the United States. The Americans had prefaced their code with the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and the French committee did likewise. The most alarming feature of all, says Daniel Roth, was in the preamble. This, while recognizing the natural rights of man, made no reference whatsoever to the rights of God. The Declaration stated in Article 10 that no one should be penalized on account of his religious beliefs. True, likewise, that the preamble contained an allusion to the Supreme Being, but the Declaration was nonetheless atheist. The revolt of the intellect, begun centuries earlier, had found therein its consummation. It's interesting to note, who was it, Chris Ferrara pointed this out to me, that there's no reference to God in the American Constitution. The French Declaration meant that Catholicism could no longer be regarded as the religion of the state, and liberty of worship was guaranteed for Protestants and Jews. The only article relating to religion in the Declaration reads in full, "No one should be disturbed for his opinions, even religious, providing that their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by law." The stipulation that the manifestation of religious belief must not disturb the public order was to provide the revolutionary government with all the latitude it needed in its subsequent persecution of the Church. Now, was nothing sacred to the revolutionaries? Indeed it was. Gwyn Lewis, the Welsh historian I've mentioned already, says, "From the beginning of the revolution, serious contradictions began to emerge between the rhetoric of liberty, equality and fraternity and the reality of a revolution led by a wealthy propertied elite." And this is something you've got to keep stressing. The French Revolution was led by a wealthy propertied elite. Property, says Gwyn Lewis, property is the key word which unlocks the major mysteries of the revolution. Although the Declaration of the Rights of Man, passed on the 26th of August 1789, begins with a famous formulation that all men are born free and equal in rights, we have to recall that Article 17 declared property to be inviolable and sacred. So there was something sacred in the French Revolution. Among the first legislation passed by the Constituent Assembly on the 22nd of December 1789 was that to qualify as a voter, one needed to pay the equivalent in direct taxes of 3 days' work. This group of about 4 million were the only people who could vote in France. They didn't vote for the government, they voted for the electors. There are about 50,000 Frenchmen who were electors. And the 50,000 electors, they had to be far more rich. They had to pay the equivalent of 10 days' work. These 50,000 electors would choose the actual deputies. And to be a deputy, you had to be incredibly rich. Just begin by quoting again the Welsh historian Gwyn Lewis, who writes, "From the beginning of the revolution, serious contradictions began to emerge between the rhetoric of liberty, equality and fraternity and the reality of a revolution led by a wealthy, propertied elite. Property is the key word which unlocks the major mysteries of the revolution. Although the Declaration of the Rights of Man, passed on the 26th of August 1789, begins with the famous formulation that all men are born free and equal in rights, we have to recall that Article 17 declared property to be inviolable and sacred. Among the first legislation passed by the Constituent Assembly on the 22nd of December 1789 was that to qualify as a voter one needed to pay the equivalent in direct taxes of 3 days' work. This group of about 4 million would choose about 50,000 electors who qualified by paying the equivalent of 10 days' work. To qualify as a deputy one had to be very rich indeed, paying over 50,000 livres a year in taxation. This, according to the radical journalist Jean-Paul Marat, was the aristocracy of wealth replacing the old aristocracy of birth." Now we're coming to a section which can be best described as state against church. The Constituent Assembly wished to bring the church completely under its control, and to attain this end it abolished tithes and nationalized the possessions of the church on the 2nd of November 1789. Stating that the church's wealth should be placed at the disposal of the nation. Monsignor de Boisgelin, Archbishop of Aix-en-Provence, warned that the church's wealth had been given for clearly defined purposes, among them the maintenance of hospitals and schools, and he declared that the proposal jeopardized the entire social and educational system of France. The Archbishop proved to be correct. In 1847, the number of hospitals in France was 47% lower than in 1789. And in 1799 there were only 12,000 students in colleges as opposed to 50,000 in 1789. The poor suffered terribly as a result of the end of monastic charity and the confiscation of endowments established for the relief of property. The nationalization of the wealth of the church did not solve the problem of national bankruptcy. The marketing of all the estates of the church at the same time caused a rapid fall in values, and the land was snapped up eagerly at bargain prices, principally by the rich bourgeoisie. And then the French government printed paper money called assignats. Initially, these were limited to the value of the land confiscated from the church and sold. But then, of course, when they ran out, they just started printing more and more, and in the end they became completely worthless. But people were forced to accept them. The salaries of the clergy were to be paid in future by an annual grant from the Treasury. On the 13th of February 1790, monastic vows were abolished in the name of religious freedom, and the religious orders suppressed. The religious life had long been the target of scathing denunciations by the philosophe, Voltaire in particular. A life dedicated to God through prayer was considered by them to be useless and of no value to society. Along with the philosophe and liberal intellectuals, Freemasons were particularly active in denouncing monasticism as a way of life. Municipal officers visited all the religious orders of men and women and gave each member of the community the option of leaving. Those who chose to do so were promised an indemnity which would be sufficient for them to live upon. Those who wished to remain in the religious life were permitted to do so, but they would be housed irrespective of their order in a few monasteries and convents which could be spared for this purpose, when the rest were sold. Where some orders of monks or friars were concerned, most of the men decided to leave. The monastery at Cluny, once the greatest and most famous in the world, now only had 50 Benedictine monks, in contrast with 300 in the 13th century. Only 2 of the 50 monks opted to remain in the religious life, and the monastery was sold to the town. The Abbey Church, which was one of the wonders of the Middle Ages, was almost completely destroyed, and many of the priceless treasures of its library burned by a revolutionary mob. The destruction of Cluny was a monstrous crime against the cultural patrimony of Europe. The fact that so many men opted to accept the pension doesn't necessarily indicate that they did so as a result of disenchantment with the religious life, as you'll see that if you read Mary's thesis when it's published. The houses of union in which those who chose to remain were to be placed were to be composed of men from different orders who would be expected to choose a superior from among themselves for a 2-year term and decide upon what rule they would follow. So strict Cistercians, they could be compared to share a house, say, with Franciscans and work out a rule that they would be satisfactory to them all, which in fact couldn't be done. And rather than do that, they decided they would leave the religious life. But even those who opted for these houses of union, they didn't stay in them very long, because on the 18th of August 1792, it was deemed that all religious houses, including the houses of union, should be suppressed in France. So they lasted little over a year. Among the male orders, the Carthusians, Trappists, and Capuchins remained faithful to their vows with very few exceptions. France's 45,000 nuns were almost unanimous in opposing the dissolution of their convents. The commissioners were told by a community of Carmelites, "The yoke of the Lord is sweet, and by some visitandines we ask to live and die in a holy, blissful state which we have freely embraced, which we zealously observe, and which constitutes the sole happiness of our days." A surprising tribute to the female religious of France came from Voltaire, who was the most scathing critic of the Church before the Revolution. Voltaire said, and it is surprising, "Perhaps there is nothing greater on earth than the sacrifice of youth and beauty, often of high birth, made by the gentle sex in order to work in hospitals for the relief of human misery, the sight of which is so revolting to our delicacy. People separated from the Roman religion have imitated, but imperfectly, so generous a charity." On the 12th of July 1790, a bill to regulate the Church entitled "The Civil Constitution of the Clergy" was passed. It contained a series of measures intended to deprive the Church in France of its independence. The Church was to become no more than a state agency, with the clergy reduced to the status of civil servants. In his study of the Church and the Revolution, J. McManus writes, "If there was a point at which the Revolution went wrong, it was when the Constituent Assembly imposed the oath of the civil constitution of the clergy." Monsignor Emery, superior of the Society of Saint-Sulpice, made clear why no true Catholic could accept the Constitution when he wrote, "To subject a power emanating from that of Jesus Christ himself to civil authority is opposed to revelation." Diocesan boundaries were to agree with those of the new departments which had been set up in France. 57 episcopal sees were suppressed. All appeals to Rome were forbidden. Bishops were to be elected by the electoral assembly of their department, and they must take an oath of loyalty to the nation, the king, the law, and the constitution. Now, I've just pointed out to you the electoral assembly was restricted to a very, very minuscule minority of the people in France. Some of whom you would be Jews, atheists, Protestants, but they were all entitled to vote who they wanted to be their bishop, who they wanted to be their parish priest. Bishops were forbidden to seek the traditional bull from Rome confirming them in their office, and they were only permitted to inform the Pope that they had been elected as bishop. Parish priests were to be elected by the electoral assembly of their districts, which in practice were of course the rich bourgeoisie. Bishops and priests were thus commanded to swear an oath of loyalty to a constitution which in effect denied the Holy See any effective power over the Church in France. Pope Pius VI urged Louis XVI not to sign the bill. The king replied that if he did not, his life and the lives of his family would be endangered. The king promulgated the Constitution on the 24th of August and was rebuked by the Pope in a confidential brief sent to the king on the 22nd of September. So I must point out here, you see, that up to this point, everything in the Revolution is imposed legally from above. It's passed by the Assembly, signed by the King. Everything that's happened so far is strictly legal. Rather like what happened after Vatican II. It was all imposed and signed by the Pope. And a revolution that comes from above like that is very, very effective. On the 27th of November 1790, a decree stipulated that all bishops and priests should, under pain of losing their offices, take an oath of loyalty to the revolutionary constitution, which included acceptance of the civil constitution of the clergy, and that all who refused and continued to exercise their priestly functions should be prosecuted as disturbers of the public peace. That was what I mentioned when I was talking about the Declaration of the Rights of Man, that people had religious liberty as long as they didn't disturb the public peace. The bill received the unwilling assent of King Louis XVI on the 26th of September 1790. The date set for taking the oath was the 23rd of January 1791. To their credit, 118 out of 125 bishops refused to take the oath, and of the 7 who did, 4 were already discredited because of their unbelief or scandalous lives. So this is interesting. I mentioned to you that all the French bishops were taken from the ranks of the aristocracy. A great number of them really had no true vocation, and they just did it to earn a living. But when it came to the crunch, you know, they behaved like, you know, really good Catholics. As we were saying in England, they kept their end up. It's a cricketing term. The bishop of the suppressed diocese of Senez declared, "I can no more renounce the spiritual contract which binds me to my church than I can renounce the promises of my baptism. I belong to my flock in life and in death. If God wishes to test his own, the 18th century, like the 1st century, will have its martyrs." Almost half the parish clergy refused to take the oath, and in some areas the figure was 90%, and many of those who took the oath retracted when they fully understood what it implied. The fact that over half the clergy took the oath was to no small extent due to the weakness of Pope Pius VI and his curia. They feared that an open confrontation with the French Assembly could lead to a schism and to the annexation of the papal territory of Avignon. The result was an 8-month irreparable delay, during the course of which, in an unforeseen way, a concatenation of circumstances caused the very schism which it had been hoped would be avoided. Nor did the delay save the papal lands of the Comtat Venaissin and the city of Avignon, which were eventually annexed on the 14th of September 1791. The Constituent Assembly then commanded the ordination of priests and bishops for the Constitutional Church. The Constitutional Church was the one made up by the priests and bishops who'd taken the oath. But even of the 7 bishops who'd taken the oath, only one of them agreed to ordain any priests or bishops, and that of course was Talleyrand. And on the 24th of February 1791, he consecrated 2 of the juring priests as bishops. A juring priest is one who took the oath, a non-juring priest is one who refused. 2 months later, Jean-Baptiste Gobel, coadjutor Bishop of Basel, who had been advanced to the position of Archbishop of Paris, ordained another 26. This made it essential for the Pope to react. Now they were consecrating bishops without his authority. He couldn't remain silent any longer. And on the 10th of March 1791, in his brief Quod aliquantum, he condemned the civil constitution of the clergy because it mortally wounded the divine constitution of the church with its canonical investment of bishops, the election of priests, and the creation of episcopal councils. In the following brief, Caritas, he declared the ordinations of new bishops sacrilegious, prohibited them from performing their offices, and threatened with suspension all priests who refused to recant their oaths. On the same occasion, the Pope strongly condemned the Declaration of the Rights of Man as contradictory to Catholic doctrine regarding the origin of authority of the state, freedom of religion, and social inequality. The civil constitution of the clergy brought about the existence of 2 churches in France, a constitutional one subservient to the authority of the state, and a refractory one maintaining obedience to the Pope. Only Daniel Rops warns that it would be wrong to pass too hasty a judgment on all the constitutional clergy. Many of them were excellent priests who took the oath in order to avoid abandoning their parishioners. Daniel Rops writes, "Their ranks included heroes and cowards, chaste and unchaste, informers and victims of the guillotine. It would be unfair to despise them all simply because they were mistaken, often in good faith, but the faithful as a whole rejected any such distinction, and the entire constitutional clergy found itself reprobated by loyal Catholics. On the 20th of September, the National Assembly legalized divorce and established the civil status, which deprived Catholic baptisms, weddings and funerals of any legal status. To this day, Catholics in France have to go through 2 weddings, a civil wedding recognized by the state and then a church weddings. These measures deprive the constitutional clergy of any credibility that some of them might have retained. Daniel Rops writes, "As for the constitutional church, it too experienced an increasing sense of anxiety. Priests and bishops who had sincerely embraced the revolution in the hope of seeing the primitive church reborn were disillusioned. The few citizens who attended their masses were often by no means edifying. The authorities whose business it was to protect them did not hesitate to employ them as instruments of power, ordering them to justify from the pulpit any measures voted by the assembly. The episcopal palaces were taken from their occupants on the grounds that their magnificence was not in accord with the simplicity of the ecclesiastical state. Public processions were forbidden. Objects of worship and piety, even crucifixes, were removed from the churches and their bronze melted down. The smallest gratuity was prohibited. Woe betide a cure who accepted an offering for a baptism or a marriage. Worse still, the marriage of priests was allowed in the name of liberty, and bishops were forbidden to punish those of their clergy who took advantage of this right. The very bases of Christian society, which those who took the oath had expected to preserve, were crumbling. On the 20th of September, the eve of its dissolution, the Assembly instituted divorce, and on the same day it established civil status, depriving the constitutional clergy of all hold upon the faithful, since baptism, marriage, and religious burial were no longer to have any legal significance. The chastisement of schism, to quote the Abbey Church, fell upon the revolutionary church, inflicted by those same individuals whom she had regarded as her allies. The hour was approaching when the revolution would rage not against the church alone, but against God. I remember a couple of years ago, someone asked John Rowe, when are we going to hear something good about the church? Because it's most of the history is of mistakes, weak popes, bad popes. Well, I think we're going to hear something good about the church now, in the Vatican II sense of the church as the people. We're going to see Catholics behaving like Catholics. And it's interesting, again, what Dr. White was saying about Satan, that he always tried to do evil, but he always turned into good. The first event I want to talk to you about are the September Massacres. The direction that the revolution would take was made clear between the 2nd and the 6th of September 1792 with the notorious September Massacres that shocked the whole of Europe. France was at war with Austria and Prussia, and a Prussian army had crossed the border in August. The country had been proclaimed to be in danger. A mood of hysteria reigned in Paris. On the afternoon of Sunday, the 2nd of September, a platoon of the National Guard dragged 3 priests from a cab that was taking them to jail and hacked them to pieces. This set in train a series of massacres in most of the prisons of Paris that lasted for 48 hours. 1,100 prisoners were massacred, with 250 priests among them, including 3 bishops. The victims of the massacre were subjected to the travesty of a trial. After that, they would pass through a door between 2 lines of killers armed with sabres, knives, and hatchets, who would literally hack them to death. All the priests were asked the same question: have you taken the oath? Not one of these priests was prepared to save his life by saying no. That none of them would lie. And one of the judges of the pseudo-trials, his name was Jean-Denis Violet, remarked the next day, he said, "I don't understand. They seem happy. They went to death as to a wedding." It was exactly what Thomas More said when he saw the first Carthusian martyrs being taken to Tyburn. He said to his daughter, "Look, they're going like bridegrooms to a wedding." Many women and children were among the victims of the massacre, the most notable being the beautiful Princess de Lamballe, who was a very close friend of Marie Antoinette. She could have saved her life by swearing an oath of hatred for the king, queen, and monarchy, but she refused. The princess was hacked to death in minutes, and her body subjected to unspeakable mutilations. One fanatical Republican went to the extent of tearing her heart out from her body and eating it. The head of the princess was struck off and carried to the temple where the royal family were imprisoned, so that Marie Antoinette could see how the people avenged themselves on tyrants. One of the most dreaded of the revolutionaries, the communist Babu, who eventually got guillotined himself, he would soon write this maxim, in which some historians have detected an avowal that there were invisible prompters behind the scenes. Babu said, "It is essential to make the people perpetrate deeds that will prevent them from turning back." On the 10th of September 1792, Gouverneur Morris, the American minister to France, dispatched an objective but critical report of the massacres to Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State. The only person I've ever heard of whose Christian name is Gouverneur. Someone might be able to tell me why that was later. This is what Gouverneur Morris said: "We have had 1 week of unchecked murders in which some thousands have perished in the city. It began with between 200 and 300 of the clergy who had been shut up because they would not take the oaths prescribed by law, and which they said was contrary to their conscience. These executors of a speedy justice went to the Abbey, where the persons were confined who were at court on the 10th. These were dispatched also, and afterwards visited the other prisons. All those who were confined either on account of accusation or suspicious of crimes were destroyed. Madame de Lamballe was, I believe, the only woman killed, which isn't correct. And she was beheaded and emboweled. The head and entrails were paraded on pikes through the streets and the body dragged after them. They continued, I am told, at the Temple, where the former royal family were now imprisoned, till the Queen looked out at this horrid spectacle. Yesterday the prisoners from Orleans were put to death at Versailles. The destruction began here about 5 in the afternoon on Sunday the 2nd instant. This dispatch did not reach Thomas Jefferson until the 10th of January 1793, but he had already seen an account of the massacres in the American press, some organs of which had condemned the massacres as barbarous. Well, this reaction in the American press, American papers condemning the September massacres as barbarous, it provoked a very indignant editorial in the 7th of November 1792 issue of the National Gazette, which was the official paper of Jefferson's Republican Party. The editor, Philip Freneau, praised the massacres in the most enthusiastic terms and denounced those who had condemned them. Whether he consulted his eminent patron Jefferson before writing an editorial from which I'll quote, nobody knows. But what is certain that this editorial did not evoke one word of criticism from Jefferson. This is Freneau's editorial describing these massacres I've just told you about. The great scene that has passed in the capital of France is a lesson worthy of the serious attention of every monarch in Europe. It is sickening to hear our prostituted prince call the French barbarous and inhuman, because, when justly incensed, they have made an example of 2,000 or 3,000 scoundrels to rescue the liberties of millions of honest men. France had not yet become a republic. King Louis XVI had been pressured into accepting the revolutionary constitution on the 14th of September 1791, but this did no more than reprieve the monarchy. And on the 22nd of September 1792, the country was proclaimed a republic. King Louis XVI was condemned to death by a narrow majority. The confessor chosen by the king before his execution was an Irish priest, the Abbé Edgeworth de Firmont, and he passed the entire night beside Louis after hearing his confession, and at 6 o'clock on the morning of the 21st of January 1793 he offered Mass. King Louis XVI received Holy Communion for the last time. A covered cart was waiting outside the prison. The king and his confessor climbed in, and the priest did not leave his side until the end. Throughout his last journey, the king read the prayer for the dying. King Louis behaved throughout with the courage and dignity expected of a king, in marked contrast with some of the men who had condemned him, who died screaming with terror later on that year when their own turn came to mount the same scaffold. Once on the platform, he began to address the crowd in a loud voice. "My people, I die innocent of the crimes with which I have been accused. I tell you this as I am about to appear in the presence of God. I pardon those who have condemned me, and I pray to God that the blood you are about to shed will never rebound upon France." Santerre, commander of the National Guard in Paris, cried out, "Tambour," drums. The drums of the guardsmen drowned the voice of their sovereign. The king was placed face down on the plank which was used to position the victims for the descent of the blade. Father Edgeworth de Firmont fell on his knees, facing the window of the guillotine through which the king's head protruded. As the heavy blade fell, this faithful priest cried out the words which have echoed through the centuries, "Son of St. Louis, mount into heaven." On that day, a spectator later recalled, everyone walked slowly, and we hardly dared to look at one another. Chrétien and Malesherbes, who had volunteered to defend the king at his trial and paid for this by going to the guillotine with members of his family, insisted that the king had paid with his own blood for being unwilling to shed that of others. The Protestant Prime Minister of England, William Pitt, described the murder of the king as the foulest and most atrocious act the world has ever seen. Simon Scarmer states that it made clear to the British government that it was now dealing with a phenomenon of uncontainable barbarism and irrationality. Queen Marie Antoinette was guillotined on the 16th of October of the same year. She displayed the same noble bearing that the king had shown. The Queen's request for a confessor who had not taken the oath of loyalty to the civil constitution was denied, and she refused to confess herself to one who had. Thomas Jefferson welcomed the news of what was taking place in 1793 and expressed only the faintest regrets about the wholesale executions or about the deaths of the king and queen and the many aristocrats that he had known personally. C.C. O'Brien remarks, Jefferson was a passionate devotee of the French Revolution, but he was also a calculating and subtle propagandist in its favor. Jefferson maintained that people should be forced to be free, although he didn't actually apply this principle to the slaves on his estates. He even justified the slaughter with an agricultural metaphor. Jefferson said, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure." And he looked forward to the day when a French Republican army would invade England and sweep away the monstrosities of crown, priests and aristocracy, so that he could come to London and dine with the victorious French general. On the 3rd of January 1793, a few days before the execution of the king, Jefferson wrote his famous Adam and Eve letter to William Short, his private secretary in Paris from 1785 to 1789. Jefferson really liked Short, and when he returned to the USA, he recommended him for the position of chargé d'affaires in Paris. But then he was very far from pleased when his protégé began to utter what Jefferson described as blasphemies against the revolution. Any criticism of the revolution was considered to be a blasphemy. In his famous Adam and Eve letter, dated the 3rd of January 1793, Jefferson castigated Short for these blasphemies and explained that while he regretted the shedding of innocent blood, it would be better to have only 2 people living still in every country in the world, provided they were free. Jefferson's entire case rested on what he considered to be an incontestable axiom, that the revolution had brought liberty to those who had previously been deprived of it. To call this axiom into question was nothing less than blasphemy. Here are his exact words: "The liberty of the whole world was depending on the issue of the contest, and was ever such a prize won with so little innocent blood. My own affections have been deeply wounded by some of the martyrs to this contest, but rather than it should have failed, I would have seen half the world desolated. Were there but an Adam and Eve left in every country, but left free, it would be better than as it now is. I have expressed to you my sentiments because they are really those of 99 in 100 of our citizens. The universal feasts and rejoicings which have lately been had on account of the successes of the French show the genuine effusions of their hearts. You have been wounded by the sufferings of your friends, and have by this circumstance been hurried into a temper of mind which would be extremely disrelished if known to your countrymen." Jefferson was certainly correct in claiming that the majority opinion in the USA was enthusiastic about the revolution. In his study, Contemporary American Opinion of the French Revolution, Charles Down Hazen describes the mounting excitement of this period. Though Americans had been interested in the revolution from the very outset for a variety of reasons, it was only toward the close of the year 1792 that this interest was publicly manifested. But when the monarch was completely overthrown and the Republic proclaimed, all America was thrilled. From this time on, the movements of the French armies were followed with great excitement, and when, towards the close of this year, the Republic had so far asserted itself as to have driven back the invaders, the revolution seemed so far accomplished as to demand a public manifestation of joy on the part of the Americans. Hazen then goes on to describe civic feasts in honor of the French Revolution in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia in December 1792 and January 1793. Hazen adds, "These celebrations were not local. They occurred in the South, in the North, and in the Middle States. Philadelphia saw scores of them." Now, I'd like to read you an assessment, Edmund Burke's assessment of the Revolution, which differs somewhat from Jefferson's, so I'll leave you to decide which one is more accurate. This is what Edmund Burke said. "The French have proved themselves the ablest architects of ruin that ever existed in the world. They have completely pulled down to the ground their monarchy, their church, their nobility, their law, their revenue, their army, their navy, their commerce, their arts, and their manufactures. They are now lying in a sort of trance, an epileptic fit, exposed to the pity or derision of mankind, in wild, ridiculous, convulsive movements, impotent to every purpose but that of dashing out their brains against the pavement. Yet they are so unwise as to glory in a revolution which is a shame and disgrace to them. They have made their way to the very worst constitution in the world by the destruction of their country." From September 1793 until the guillotining of Robespierre in July 1794, the whole of France was engulfed by what became known as the Terror. The Terror was not formally declared by law, but was permitted and soon encouraged by the ruling powers. Henri Daniel Rots writes, Christian France was swept by a wave of fanaticism at once cruel, despicable and absurd, such as always experienced at times of mass hysteria. Determined atheists, loyal in varying degrees to the teaching of the philosophe, availed themselves of this opportunity to conduct operations whose purpose was nothing less than the suppression of all belief. It was not only against the Church that the Revolution directed its attack, but against the faith itself, against God. On the 6th of April 1793, the Committee of Public Safety was established by the Convention. It was comprised of 9, later 12 members, and it became the key organ of the Terror. The dominant voice for the first 2 months was that of Danton, who would later sign his death warrant by preaching a policy of union and reconciliation within the Republic, and by seeking to abate the pitiless severity of the Revolutionary Tribunal, which he himself had set up. As the Reign of Terror developed, Danton began to lose power to Robespierre, and he resigned from the committee on the 10th of July 1793. 2 weeks later, on the 27th of July, Maximilian Robespierre was elected. He was to be the most notorious member of the committee, and for a period could be said to be the committee. In the 3 months that followed the guillotining of Danton on the 5th of April 1794, Robespierre reigned supreme, nominating all the members of government committees, placing his supporters in all positions of influence within the Commune of Paris, and assuming total control of the Revolutionary Tribunal. He reigned by terror and abused the power invested in him. Second only to Robespierre in notoriety was his fervent disciple, Louis de Saint-Just, who had been foremost among those demanding the execution of the king. If the king is innocent, the people are guilty, Saint-Just said. He initiated the attacks upon Danton that sent him to the scaffold. Saint-Just even proposed that Robespierre should be created dictator of France, and that boys should be taken from their parents at the age of 7 and brought up by the state. The mandate of the Committee of Public Safety included all matters of internal order and policy, and was expanded to include control of the army. Although in theory France was still governed by the Convention, executive power was in practice invested in the committee. Simon Scarmer describes it as the most concentrated state machine France has ever experienced. What amounted to a charter of terror, the law of suspects of the 17th of September 1793, gave the committee sweeping powers of arrest and punishment over anyone included in the all-embracing category of those harbouring counter-revolutionary designs. Saint-Just insisted that the law should be applied with the utmost rigour. Between the people and their enemies there can be nothing in common but the sword. We must govern by iron those who cannot be governed by justice. We must oppress the tyrant. It is impossible for the revolutionary law to be executed unless the government itself is truly revolutionary. The French equivalent of civil rights such as habeas corpus and trial by jury were suspended in the case of anyone endangering the security of the state. And the very fact that a citizen was accused of this crime by the Committee of Public Safety was considered irrefutable proof of his guilt. In the trials of so-called enemies of state, the calling of witnesses was left to the discretion of the court, and the accused was denied the aid of a defence counsel. When he was found guilty, the mandatory sentence was death. The law of suspects ushered in a terrible phase of the terror during the spring and summer of 1794. Whole batches of suspects were condemned and sent to their deaths in the Place de la Révolution, Paris. The vast majority were political suspects, in most cases men who had been fervent supporters of the events of 1789. Representatives on mission were dispatched by the Convention to the departments of France to ensure compliance with the will of the Convention, which from September 1793 meant the will of the Committee of Public Safety. Their mandate was concerned primarily with judicial and punitive matters, and they were invested with the authority to establish revolutionary tribunals and to try suspects accused of anti-revolutionary activities. Each commune was to set up a committee of surveillance, and every citizen was urged to denounce anyone he suspected of this crime. Many Frenchmen were denounced and went to their deaths to satisfy the personal animosity of their neighbours. Throughout the autumn of 1793, representatives on mission had been free to interpret their role much as they wished. This phase of the terror was anarchic, uncoordinated, and little subject to central direction. Its characteristic instruments were the revolutionary armies, which mushroomed through the provinces in imitation of that of Paris, and whose numbers may have reached 48,000 men at their height. Terroristic jacks of all trades, their purpose was to intimidate and punish, arrest and repress anyone suspected of activities that could be deemed hostile to the revolution. An integral aspect of the terror was the de-Christianization of France. It was not initiated as an official policy of the Convention, but the Convention did not attempt to curtail it, and eventually endorsed it by adopting a new anti-Christian calendar on the 6th of October 1793, in which years were to be numbered not from the birth of Christ, but from the inauguration of the Republic on the 22nd of September 1792. This meant that it was already year 2 when the revolutionary calendar was imposed. The year began with the 22nd of September, and the first month was named Vendémiaire, and it ended on the 21st of October. There were 12 30-day months, each with newly coined names, each with 3 10-day weeks. These were called décades, with the 10th day one of rest, décade. Sunday thus became a working day. The Republican calendar remained in official use for 10 years, but it was never taken seriously by the people. Most Frenchmen and nearly all French women preferred the saints and ceremonies of the Catholic calendar to the rootless festivals and formless supreme being of Robespierre. De-Christianization was not uniform throughout France and depended to a large extent on the fanaticism of the representative on mission. But the adoption of the revolutionary calendar encouraged the representatives to vie with each other in repressing every vestige of Catholicism. Joseph Fouché, the representative in Nièvre in central France, was a former Oratorian priest, imposed a reign of religious terror. No form of religion could be practiced in public. Cemeteries were stripped of all religious symbols, and at their gates was posted his famous dictum, "Death is an eternal sleep." Herbert Gédan, in his history of this period, considers that the enormous wave of de-Christianization which swept over the country between the summer of 1793 and the summer of 1794 completed the ruin of the constitutional church and drove it underground. No distinction was made now between juring and non-juring priests. Constitutional priests were now required to abjure their ordination. Only this step would prove their loyalty to the Republic. But large numbers of the constitutional clergy chose death rather than deny their priesthood. Of the 484 clergy who appeared before the Revolutionary Tribunal in Paris, 319 belonged to the constitutional church. Many repudiated the oath which bound them to the civil constitution, begged to be reconciled to the church, and died bravely on the scaffold. 8 constitutional bishops were guillotined, 5 of them recanting their errors before dying. Henri Daniel Roch states correctly that those sacrifices cannot be forgotten when we pass judgment upon the constitutional clergy. Churches were vandalized throughout France during this frenzy of de-Christianization. This actually sounds a bit like what happened after Vatican II, but images were destroyed, altarpieces slashed, stained glass windows smashed, liturgical books and holy pictures burned, and sacred vestments used in blasphemous parodies of Catholic ritual. The images of kings on the facade of Notre Dame were removed. There is scarcely a cathedral facade in France that does not bear traces of such vandalism. In addition to the destruction of Cluny, many great abbeys were razed to the ground, including Notre Dame de Montmartre, Royaumont, Longjumeau, and Jumièges. The word saint was removed from the names of streets, towns, and villages. Stone images of saints were solemnly guillotined. Clerical dress was forbidden, churches were closed throughout the land, and by the spring of 1794 remained open for worship only in the remotest corners of France. Despite this, Mass continued to be offered in secret throughout the country. In Paris, at the height of the terror, heroic priests offered Mass in 150 locations, and there were another 100 in the surrounding countryside. Along the route to the scaffold, there were always priests ready to give absolution secretly to those in the tumbrils. And if one of those chaplains of the guillotine, as they were called, was arrested, there was no lack of volunteers to take his place. 20,000 priests were terrorized into abjuring their orders, and 6,000 had given their renunciation the ultimate confirmation by marrying. The number of priests who died in the terror would have been vastly greater had not so many of them immigrated. Estimates of this number have been as many as 40,000, but this is, I think, certainly an exaggeration. It must be said to the credit of these priests that they refused to compromise with the revolution. But emigration was certainly an easier option than the persecution of the terror. But leaving in France did involve them in many sacrifices, both spiritual and material. Many were totally destitute when they reached the countries that they hoped would welcome them. Where most Catholic countries were concerned, they were swiftly disillusioned. Austria and Bavaria refused any émigré clergy entry, as did most Italian states, apart from those of the Pope, who received 5,000. Many great European abbeys refused their hospitality to the émigrés, and one of them, that of Weingarten, set dogs upon any French priest who tried to enter its cloisters. Spain welcomed the émigré clergy, as did the Catholic cantons of Switzerland, which accepted and cared for 4,000 priests. The great abbey of Einsiedeln spent enormous sums to help them. But one country in Europe exceeded the whole of Europe in its generous hospitality, and it was a Protestant nation. Henri Daniel Roth's right, but it was England who proved herself above all others the home of kindly hearts. She was publicly thanked by Pope Pius VI, who offered her as an example to the whole of Europe. Nearly 10,000 priests and 31 bishops made their home in England. Latest Pitt spoke of them in these words: "Few will ever forget the piety, the irreproachable conduct, the long and dolorous patience of these men, cast suddenly into the midst of a foreign people, different in its religion, its language, its manners and customs. They won the respect and goodwill of all by a life of unvarying godliness and decency." Thanks to this contact, many of the prejudices against the Catholics vanished in England, and the presence of these French priests helped in a large manner to obtain for English Catholics full equality of rights, and also pioneered the renaissance of English Catholicism in the 19th century. The heroism with which so many of the clergy, religious and laymen sacrificed their lives for the faith marks what must be the most glorious page in the history of Catholicism in France, the eldest daughter of the Church. That's why I was saying that Satan tries to do evil, but it turns into good. And this was certainly the most glorious page in the history of French Catholicism. From February 1794, 850 priests who had been arrested in northern France and Belgium, which had also been conquered by the Revolutionary Army, were imprisoned in 3 old ships, formerly used for the transport of slaves. They were subjected to appalling treatment by their captors. Many died in hideous epidemics, and when an order for their release was signed in February 1795, 7 months after the death of Robespierre, only 274 of the 850 were left alive. All could have saved their lives by renouncing their faith, but they preferred to use their sufferings to intensify their spiritual lives. The heroism of the Carmelites of Compiègne will also remain an inspiration to every Catholic who truly loves the faith. They were brought before a revolutionary court and charged with remaining together as a community after their convent had been suppressed. One of the sisters asked the president of the tribunal why he called them fanatics. He replied, "Your fanaticism is your foolish attachment to your stupid religious practices." Upon which he cried, "There you are, sisters, we have been condemned for our religion. What happiness to die for our God." At the foot of the scaffold they renewed their vows, and then intoned the Salve Regina, which continued until the last of them was silenced. Hardly less sublime were the Sacramentines of Boulogne. Before dying they thanked their judges and executioners, and one of them kissed the scaffold before mounting it. The Republicans were referred to our Holy Mother Guillotine, or Sacrum Sanctum Guillotinam. In the city of Angers it was constantly in use, but could not cope with the number of prisoners. The Republicans investigated several means of mass killings, including the possibility of poisoning wells or fabricating a poison gas to asphyxiate the prisoners. But at Angers it was decided that mass shootings, called fusillade, would be the most cost-effective method of eliminating Catholics. A fanatical Republican living just outside the city at Avrier offered his field for the purpose. "Send out as many as you can," he said. "They will make good fertilizer." Catholics were marched outside the town in batches of 400. They were tied together in pairs, and the pairs linked by a long rope. Ditches had been dug on the previous evening. The victims were lined up in batches of 50 and then shot so that they fell into the ditches. Many were only wounded, and they were finished off with swords and bayonets. Half the victims were women. This became a standard method of execution for Catholic prisoners. At least 2,000 were murdered in this way between January and April 1794. The field where these humble Catholics died is now known as the Field of the Martyrs of Avrier, and the track that leads to it as the Path of Silence. On the 19th of February 1984, 100 martyrs of Avrier were beatified by Pope John Paul II including 12 priests who were guillotined and not shot. Many favours have been obtained through the intercession of these martyrs. The crime for which these poor people, mostly peasants, humble artisans, weavers and domestic servants, were executed was fanaticism. In order to be guilty of fanaticism, it was sufficient to be related to a Vendéan soldier. I'll be telling you about the Vendéan War this afternoon. To have hidden a refractory priest, to have refused to assist at the Mass of a juring priest, or to have made a rosary. We read in the transcript of the trial of Blessed Catherine Cotenceau. Question: did you receive refractory priests at Chanteloup, and did you assist at their ceremonies? Yes, I did. When you had a constitutional priest, did you assist at his Mass? No, never. The judgment that sentenced her to death reads, she detested the priest who had sworn the oath and wanted to keep her former cure. She is a fanatic. The letter F for fusillade, shooting, was written in the margin. The procession from the prisons to the field where the shootings took place was such a terrifying spectacle that the inhabitants along the way closed their doors and shuttered their windows to avoid seeing it. A witness to these appalling spectacles wrote, "The air was heavy, as it is just before a storm. One could scarcely breathe, suffocated by fear." In the midst of this dark horror, the radiant faith of the martyrs could not be obscured. A witness of the martyrdom of Blessed Marie-Louise de la Saunière wrote, "It was a heartbreaking cortege. The unfortunates were going to their death, weeping and in torment, when suddenly a magnificent voice that seemed to have come straight from heaven began to sing. It was Marie-Louise de la Saunière. Radiant in her youth and beauty, she had a magnificent voice, sweet, calm, embellished by study, that comforted everyone to the point that the condemned who had just been weeping began to start singing enthusiastically. As they passed before the Church of the Trinity, a poor woman, badly clothed, shivering from the cold, stood by, watching the procession. Marie de la Saunière, moved by her misery, took off the shawl of silk and fur that she was wearing and gave it to her. At the sight of such beauty and such heroic charity, the procession stopped. Everyone, victims and executioners alike, looked on, moved and admiring. The officer who was leading the military escort, touched to the bottom of his soul, came forward respectfully to Mademoiselle de la Saunière and proposed marriage to her in order to save her life. "I would like that," she replied, "but on condition that you also save my mother and my sister." The officer, an honest man, answered that he could not do so, as it would be a promise that he could not keep. Very simply, the young girl replied, "Then let me die." With a voice even stronger than before, she took up the hymn to the Virgin Mary that she had been singing and continued on her way. Two sisters of charity were among the martyrs of Avrier, Blessed Sisters Marianne Vaillot and Blessed Odile Bogard. An eyewitness writes, "Sister Marianne was tied to her companion and went courageously to her martyrdom without flinching. I would not exchange my place with anyone," she said. Her face shone with joy, but Sister Odile seemed troubled by the preparations for the executions. Sister Marianne reassured her and lifted up her thoughts to consider the crown destined for her. "We must not miss such a beautiful occasion to witness for our love for our divine spouse," she explained. "This is the most beautiful and most joyful day of our lives. He is going to put an end to all our miseries, and we are going to have the happiness of seeing God and possessing Him for all eternity." Hearing these words, the good Sister Odile recovered herself, ashamed to have feared death. She asked God and her dear companion to pardon her. The two nuns made their way, heads held high, to the site of their execution. On the way to the field where they were to be shot, Sister Odile dropped her rosary. She bent down to pick it up, and a soldier crushed her fingers with the butt of his musket. The spot where this took place was long revered, and pilgrims knelt there to pray. The rosary was recovered and is treasured to this day as a precious relic. Finally, like lambs led to the slaughter, the victims arrived at the place of their execution. They raised their eyes to heaven and offered to their Heavenly Father the sacrifice of their lives. They put their confidence in God and saw the heavens open to receive them. The officer in command of the shootings took pity upon the two sisters. He came forward and said to them, "Citizens, there is still time to escape this death that menaces you. You have rendered services to humanity. Why, for an oath that you are asked to swear, would you discontinue the good works that you have always performed? Do not swear the oath if it's repugnant to you. I will take it upon myself to say that you have sworn, and I'll give my word that nothing will happen to you." Citizen, replied Sister Marianne, not only do we not want to swear this oath, but we do not even want to appear that we have sworn it. Do not think us so cowardly and so attached to this miserable life that you believe us capable of staining our soul and sacrificing it for an oath which we have always detested and still detest. God will not ask us to render an account of the services we could have rendered to our neighbour only by swearing an oath that he detests and condemns. If taking the oath is the only way that we can save our lives, we declare that we prefer to die rather than do anything opposed to the love that we have sworn for our God. The officer gave the order to fire. Sister Marianne remained standing, her arm broken. Like St. Stephen, she prayed for her persecutors. Forgive them, she said, they know not what they do. The soldiers threw themselves upon her and upon the other victims, cutting them to pieces with their sabres and bayonets. The culmination of the campaign of Decryptionization took place in Notre Dame Cathedral, now transformed to a temple of reason, on the 10th of November 1973. And Liberty, a red-capped female bearing a pike, a masterpiece of nature, euphemistically described as an actress, emerged from a temple constructed from linen and papier-mâché. She bowed to the flame of reason and seated herself upon a bank of flowers and plants while long lines of garlanded girls sung hymns. She was then escorted to the National Convention and embraced by its president. What a bunch of idiots. But a mob of Republicans remained in the cathedral to profane it with an evening of drunken revelry. Even Robespierre was shocked by this nonsense and described it as a ridiculous farce. 500,000 Frenchmen were imprisoned or placed under house arrest during the months of the Terror. At least 17,000 died on the scaffold. When those who died in prison or while awaiting trial are added to this figure, together with those who were simply murdered or lynched without trial or official record, the number of deaths rises to over 30,000 people in just a year. 15% of the death sentences were upon members of the nobility and clergy, and 25% upon the middle classes. And the vast majority of those who lost their lives in the proscription of 1793 to 4, two-thirds of those officially condemned, and doubtless a far higher proportion of those who disappeared unofficially, were ordinary people, caught up in tragic circumstances, not of their own making, who made wrong choices in lethal times, when indifference itself counted as a crime. For many Jacobins, there was little in these figures to shock. They preferred to see terror as a vital means of purging the country of those who, by their acts and opinions, had forfeited any claim to citizenship. In the preface to his book Citizens, Simon Scarman insists that, in some depressingly unavoidable sense, violence was the revolution itself. Robespierre and Saint-Just were themselves arrested on the 27th of July 1794 and guillotined the next day with 20 of their closest supporters. Saint-Just acted the role of a Roman Stoic on the scaffold, where Robespierre died with animal screams that were silenced only by the falling of the blade. Within a month of Robespierre's death, the Committee of Public Safety was deprived against its own advice of its overall superintending role in government. All its duties, with the exception of war and foreign relations, were distributed among other committees. The central institution of terror and revolutionary government had been dismantled. In 1799 came the coup d'etat of Napoleon. The Republic was to all intents and purposes overthrown. It was to be governed by 3 consuls. Napoleon was appointed first consul for 10 years, but in 1804 he proclaimed himself emperor and ruled France in a manner far more absolute than any king had ever done. Bonaparte never made the mistake of underestimating either the power of religion or the resilience of the church. This judgment was reinforced by peasant uprisings in defense of the faith in parts of France, above all in the Vendée, in Belgium, Switzerland, Luxembourg and Italy. When the revolutionary armies plundered churches and showed complete contempt for the religious faith of the peoples they claimed to be liberating, they often compared these revolts to the revolt in the Vendée in France. Bonaparte saw what damage such behaviour could do. In June 1800 he convoked the clergy of Milan to the great cathedral and declared, "It is my firm intention that the Christian, Catholic and Roman religion shall be preserved in its entirety, that it shall be publicly performed. No society can exist without morality. There is no good morality without religion. It is religion alone, therefore, that gives to the state a firm and durable support. As soon as I am able to confer with the new Pope, I hope to have the happiness of removing every obstacle which will hinder complete reconciliation between France and the head of the Church." Bonaparte referred to the new Pope as Pius VI had died in France in 1799, having been taken there as a prisoner of the Revolution. His death in captivity marked the lowest ebb of the papacy for many centuries. In 1801, Napoleon signed a concordat with the Holy See. While it left much to be desired, it restored free worship to France, a properly constituted clergy, and papal power. William Doyle considers that the papacy emerged from the Revolution as a stronger and more respected institution. He writes, only 2 more pages. William Doyle writes, despite serious material losses, in fact, the papacy was one of the great gainers of the work of the Revolution. In the 1780s, it had appeared an institution in perhaps terminal decline, scorned by secularizing monarchs and defied in Germany and Italy by Jansenizing bishops. Its apparent helplessness did much to mislead the drafters of the civil constitution. But before the end of the 1790s, the Holy Father himself was sharing the glory of martyrdom, visited on his fellow priests by a godless republic and its sympathizers abroad. Meanwhile, the vast majority of the population of France was showing itself loyal to a clergy which had rejected the revolution on his instructions. As Alwyn Houghton expressed it, popular Catholicism, with women in the vanguard, emerged from the Terror and Directory bloody but distinctly unbowed. A mass celebrated in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in April 1802 could hardly have provided a more dramatic contrast to the emergence of liberty from her papier-mâché chateau. April 1802 was to be a month of celebration. It culminated on the 18th, Easter Day, with a solemn Mass to mark the resurrection of the Catholic Church in France. It was held in Notre Dame in the presence of the first consul, Bonaparte, the entire government, and the diplomatic corps. The preacher was the 70-year-old Bourgeoisie, once Archbishop of Aix, now of Tours. A nobleman of the old stock, he had delivered the sermon at the coronation of Louis XVI. As then, he celebrated a new beginning, but the jubilant crowds who thronged Paris that day, thrilled by the boom of cannon and the ringing of bells, silenced in 1793, and by the people of quality who lit their windows when night fell, were not thinking about what the future might bring. With the end of the war, the elimination of... when night fell, we're not thinking about what the future might bring. With the end of the war, the elimination of political strife, and the restoration of religious freedom, they were celebrating the burial of the revolution. And, I really do think the heroism of all those Catholics of France, especially, I must say, especially the women. I wouldn't have... I think if that God had offered to marry me, I probably wouldn't have accepted. But, mentioned in my earlier talk that... the revolutionary government replaced all the traditional provinces of France with new departments. And one of the departments established in 1789 was the Vendée. The Vendée is the name of a somewhat insignificant river in the new department. The counter-revolutionary rising, which took place in 1793, was known as the Grande Guerre de la Vendée, the Great War of the Vendée. The war was not confined to this department, but spilled over into the neighboring departments of the Loire-Inférieure, Maine-et-Loire, and Deux-Sèvres. This area is referred to by historians as La Vendée Militaire, the military Vendée. In the account of the rising which follows, the term Vendée refers to the Vendée Militaire and not simply to the department of that name. Most historians, of course, don't mention the Vendée in English-speaking countries or in France. It's a non-event. It would have been in Orwell's 1984. It just never happened because everybody was so happy with the French Revolution. Why would anybody have wanted to oppose it? The actual department of the Vendée is a vast territory of more than 12,000 square kilometers, comprising of parts of 3 of the most ancient French provinces, Anjou, Brittany, and Poitou. At the end of the 18th century, much of the territory was covered with dense woodlands, deep valleys, moors, heaths, and rivers. The large area known as the Bocage, wooded region, in the center of the department contained only 2 metal thoroughfares. Communication between villages was confined to tracks, often dating back to prehistoric times, with high banks overshadowed by trees and bushes, perfect country for guerrilla warfare. It was a region inhabited largely by peasant farmers engaged in intensive agriculture and was an important source of food for Paris. The department was one of very contrasting regions with contrasting characteristics among the people who inhabited them. The Vendée Militaire was certainly the most Catholic region in the whole of France. The people were devoted to their priests, who were frequently members of families living in the very parishes they served. There was no greater honor for a Vendéan peasant family than to have a son become a priest. Between the priest and the peasant, there was no rivalry, mistrust, or conflict. The people not only loved and looked up to their priests, but expected them to be worthy of respect. The people were, in general, equally devoted to the nobility, in a manner that was unique for the whole of France. Complaints of unjust or absentee landlords were unknown in the Vendée. The aristocrats did not burden their peasants with unjust taxes, and in fact they had not exercised their feudal privileges since the 17th century. It was the general practice for the curé, the parish priest, to announce from the pulpit hunts organized by the lords on their own estates, and to invite the peasants to take part. This was a gesture unique to the Vendée. There was practically no crime in the region. There were very few lawsuits. It was a bad place for lawyers to live. And there was an exceptionally high rate of literacy for rural France at this time, which was thanks almost entirely to the zeal of the clergy. The people of the Vendée were outraged when their priests were required to take the oath of loyalty to the revolutionary constitution. Only 1 in 6 of the clergy in the Vendée took the oath, and of those who did, many later recanted. The fact that 5 out of every 6 priests refused to take the oath is truly amazing in view of the fact that a refusal to do so meant an immediate loss of income. And as you know, to all traditional Catholic clergy, income is something that really matters. But so that shows that's a great sacrifice to begin with. They were prepared to forego their income in the interests of the faith. Clergy, as I told you this morning, who took the oath were called the juring clergy, jurors, or constitutional priests. Those who refused the oath were the non-juring clergy, or non-jurors. The word juror is derived from the French verb jurer, to take an oath. The juring clergy were referred to by the Vendéens as intrus, which means intruders, which was usually abbreviated as trout or trouton. So if they saw a juring priest come in, they'd say, look at that so-and-so trout. These intruding clergy, they were foreigners where the Vendéens were concerned, from cities such as Paris, and they were intruded into a country that was not their own, and into parishes where nobody wanted them. The non-juring clergy were referred to by the Republicans as réfractaires, which means refractory, stubborn, or rebellious. The government not only alienated the entire peasant population of the Vendée by persecuting their beloved non-juring clergy, but by attempting to impose the despised jurors upon parishes that did not want them. Non-juring priests warned their people to shun the intruding juror, l'intrus, who would eventually replace him. They warned young couples to be married before the intrus arrived, since any marriages that he conducted would not be valid as the Pope had deprived him of his jurisdiction. The missionary order of the Mulotins, founded by St. Louis-Marie Grignon de Montfort, who lived from 1673 to 1716, was particularly active in persuading the faithful not to accept the juring priests. The preaching of this saint and his priests had played no little part in ensuring that the Vendéens were the most fervent Catholics in France. The National Assembly sent juring clergy into the Vendée from Paris and other large cities. Resentment towards them was so great that they frequently needed an armed escort of National Guards to escort them to their installation, through crowds of parishioners shouting, "Ne jurez pas, ne vous damnez pas," do not take the oath, do not damn yourself. When a juring priest was able to take possession of his new parish, he might well find that his predecessor had taken all the sacred vessels, mass vestments, and keys. What the priest could not take with him, the people hid. Juring priests were hooted at, jeered at, and even kicked when they appeared in public. The faithful would not assist at the mass of a juring priest, as they considered their church to have been profaned by his very presence. When the Abbé Pierre from Paris was installed as the parish priest of Massacres, he was followed into the church by women who scrubbed the stone floor everywhere he had put his feet, because they believed his footsteps had polluted their church. Assisting at the mass of a juring priest was considered to be an endorsement of the revolution. No peasant wanted to be seen even in the presence of a juror, since he was considered to be a carrier of a spiritual plague. Children who made their first communion with him were said to have become food for the devil. Parents of newly born children would refuse to have them baptized by juring priests, and would be literally marched to the church at gunpoint by National Guards. And these National Guards, who were probably atheists, would have to act as godfathers, since no one else would be present. National Guards also had to act as servers, crucifers, or candle bearers during the Mass, as the sacristan and altar boys refused to be present. The position of the antru was not helped by the fact that the non-juring curé would often stay in or near his parish, usually hiding in the homes of parishioners. He exhorted his people to resist the government and the antru, and he offered Mass for them in secret. Another means widely adopted to outwit the government was to multiply the already numerous and very popular local pilgrimages. The faithful would march along the country lanes, usually at night, to pray at roadside shrines and chapels, where, by a planned coincidence, they would happen to meet their non-juring curé, who would administer the sacraments to them. The immediate cause of the Vendéan uprising was the decree of the General Assembly of the 24th of February 1793 that 300,000 men were to be conscripted into the revolutionary army. News of the September massacres had reached the remotest villages, and the Vendéens were still in a state of shock at the murder of the king, the good king, le bon roi, only a few weeks before. The very idea of joining the army of a regime which persecuted good priests, attacked religion, and had killed the good king was one which these exemplary Catholics would not so much as consider. The Vendéens resented the fact that their able-bodied young men should be taken far away from the farms that needed their labor to fight with men with whom they had no quarrel, on behalf of those who were implacably opposed to every belief that they held dear. They resented the fact that the conscription decree was implemented by the bourgeoisie from the local town, who were themselves exempted from conscription because of the public offices that they held. These bourgeoisie were the same men who had bought up the best church lands at a premium when they had been nationalized in 1789. These were men who had been rich before the revolution and had been made even richer by the revolution at the expense of honest peasants and the church, to which the peasants gave their love and their loyalty. As one peasant expressed it, "They have killed our king, chased away our priests, sold the goods of our church, eaten everything they have, and now they want to take our bodies. No, they shall not have them." The tocsin sounded in 700 parishes. The tocsin was the alarm calling the faithful to arms. The Catholics of the Vendée rose as one man to fight for religion and the good king, in what has been described as the last crusade. The rising was entirely spontaneous. It had not been planned in any way at all, even though the revolutionary authorities claimed that it had been instigated by the clergy and the nobles. The clergy and the nobility had, in most cases, been reluctant to encourage an armed rising. The Catholic peasants were not trained soldiers, and very few had any experience of actual warfare. The numbers grew in different localities by dozens, by hundreds, and eventually by thousands, and they sought out leaders mostly, but not exclusively, from among the aristocracy. Perhaps the most celebrated of the non-aristocratic leaders was Jacques Catalineau, known as the Saint of the Anjou. Catalineau was a peddler, known throughout the wide region where he sold his wares at fairs, markets, and crossroads, in tiny hamlets and during village pilgrimages. He had not hesitated to denounce the revolution and everything connected with it, particularly the persecution of the church. On the 13th of March 1793, he told his fellow villagers at Panon-Mauges that war could no longer be avoided. They must take up arms against the Republic, or the Vendée would be crushed. His wife begged him to change his mind. "Think of me," she implored, "and think of our 5 children. Do not be afraid," he assured her. "God, for whom I shall fight, will protect you." Catalineau armed himself with his rosary, a pistol, and a saber, pinned a badge of the Sacred Heart upon his tunic, and went out into the village square. During the 17th century, the whole of western France, as I told you, had been stirred by the missions of Saint Louis Marie Grignon de Montfort, and the red badge of the Sacred Heart, popularized by the saint, was to become the principal emblem of the Vendéan soldiers, together with the cocarde blanche, the white cockade, which was the symbol of legitimate Christian monarchy. The supporters of the Stuart monarchy in England wore the white cockade for the same reason. 27 young men were waiting for Catalino. They went to pray in their church, which had been closed for a year because the curé had refused the oath. A beautiful bronze statue of Catalino was erected outside the church in 1993. The original church was destroyed by the Republicans, but eventually rebuilt with a series of exquisite stained glass windows depicting important events in the history of the Rising. Dr. Bob and Tom Brannan and myself were there just a few weeks ago. We made a tour of the Vendée, and I've got some pictures in this album taken by Dr. Bob, which I'd be happy to show anyone. There's a very nice picture of the statue of Catalino. The peasants left the church with cries of "Vive la religion," long live religion, and marched to other villages to find recruits. By midday, their numbers had swollen to 500. Resolved to waste no time, Catalino led his men to the small town of Jalais. "My friends," he exhorted them, "never forget that we are fighting for our holy religion." Following his example, the tiny army fell to its knees and intoned the Vexilla Regis. Vexilla Regis prodeunt fulgent Christis crucis mysterium. The banners of the King go forth, the mystery of the cross shines, by which our life bore death, and by death gave us life. They attacked immediately, armed for the most part with little more than cudgels and scythes. The town fell with very little resistance, and their numbers having grown to 2,000, they went on to take the town of Chemillé, although it was defended fiercely by 300 blues with 3 cannon. Catalino's profoundly Catholic instinct was made clear when his first action after the capture of the town was to lead his men into the ancient Angevin church of Notre Dame to sing a Te Deum of thanksgiving. Peasant farmers, labourers and weavers had thus dared to do what both nobles and clergy had shrunk from, to take up arms against the forces of evil. I think it's a little reflection on our times that with universal Catholic education, for instance, even a committed group like you and myself included, if I asked you to get up now and sing the Te Deum by heart, there'd be very few people who could do it. Yet these peasants, they all knew the Vexilla Regis, the Te Deum, the Christus Vincit, they knew them all by heart. The most celebrated of all the Vendéan leaders was François Anatole Charette de la Contrie, referred to invariably as Charette, which is lucky. We've been waiting for a long time for our cocktails, so I had to say his full name every time. He was born in 1763, the youngest of a family of 3 daughters and 7 sons. He was educated at the Oratorian College in Nantes, where he showed exceptional mathematical ability, joined the Navy in 1779, and was almost continually at war during his 9 years of service, including action alongside the revolutionaries in America. Charette was the least inclined of all the Vendéan leaders to integrate his forces totally into the Catholic and Royal Army. He was also far from inclined to involve himself in the uprising. As a professional military man, he probably realized that the possibility of a victory over the revolutionary forces was not great. It is even claimed that when a crowd of peasants arrived at his home to put him at their head, he hid beneath the bed to avoid them. He eventually agreed to speak to them, but refused outright to put himself at their head. "Be sensible," he urged them. "Return to your homes." Tempers became heated. Charette was accused of cowardice. "It is shameful," the peasants told him, "for an officer of the king to refuse to fight the enemies of God and the king." This was more than he could bear. "Very well then, if that's the way you want it, I accept. But you must accept my conditions. I will be the master, and when I command you will obey, and I will break the head of anyone who does not obey." Charette then took a solemn oath never to return to his home unless victorious or dead. He was particularly celebrated for the panache of the uniform he designed for himself. He wore a high-crowned hat with a narrow brim and 2 gold bands about it. The brim was turned up at the front by a clasp holding a white Bourbon plume. A very distinctive feature was the large white handkerchief with red spots worn under the hat, the famous mouchoir de Cholet, handkerchief from Cholet, which was adopted by most Vendéan generals. His coat was sometimes of hunting green, and at others of a bluer snuff colour, with a broad white sash, buckskin breeches and boots with brown tops. There's an excellent picture of Charette in my book, which I omitted to say all the pictures in the book have been done by Tom Brannan. He's probably embarrassed by my saying that, but they're the best thing in the book. But you can have a look at Charette's picture afterwards. A former Count General Marseille, this is a little point, most of the revolutionary armies were led by former aristocrats who renounced their titles and went over to the revolution. A former Count General Marseille was sent from La Rochelle to suppress the rising with 2,400 infantry and 100 cavalry. An experienced soldier, Marseille was apprehensive when he entered the wilderness of the Bocage, that's the wooded region. As evening fell near Saint-Vincent-Stellange on the 19th of March, hundreds of silhouettes appeared in the next valley. Marseille was about to order his troops to open fire when a subordinate cried out with excitement that they must be Republicans because they were singing the Marseillaise. What Marseille did not realize was that the Catholic army had composed its own anti-Republican version of the Republican hymn. By the time he realized that he was in the presence of the Catholic army, it was too late. The silhouettes vanished behind the hedges and into the ditches. Shots came ringing out from every direction. Cries of "Vive la Religion, Vive le Roi" rang out, and the blues were put to flight. The Vendéans had by this time come to refer to all Republican troops as blues, professional soldiers as well as the despised National Guard. 500 blues and 200 peasants were buried the next day, and the Catholic army gained a large quantity of weapons. As the war progressed, the Catholic army equipped itself with weapons taken from the defeated blues. By the 21st of March, a good number of other towns and villages had been taken, and the Catholic and Royal Army could have captured without difficulty all the great cities of the region, Nantes, La Rochelle, Angers, and Tours. Napoleon has testified to the fact that they could have marched unopposed to Paris, taken it, and overthrown the revolution. But, as was almost invariably the case during the entire campaign, having won their victory, the peasants disbanded themselves and returned to their homes and their farms on this occasion to prepare for Easter. Who are these Vendéans? Asked the deputies at the National Convention. On the 23rd of March 1793, the convention decided to end the uprising once and for all. An army of 35,000 professional soldiers was sent to wipe out the rebels. It was commanded by the former aristocrat, General Berryer, who travelled everywhere with a large retinue of cooks and servants. Berryer made the Vendéans furious by massacring the inhabitants of the village of Barret. On the 11th of April 1793, the outraged Catholics put Berrier's army to flight, capturing hundreds of prisoners. Not surprisingly, the Catholic soldiers wished to massacre their prisoners, just as the villagers of Barret had been massacred. The Catholic commander was Joseph Louis Maurice Gigot d'Elbée, who had served as a regular soldier in the cavalry, but had retired to his small estate in the country in 1791 to live the life of an obscure country gentleman, apparently unconcerned with the political and religious crises surrounding him. A deputation of peasants visited d'Elbée at his chateau of La Loge to persuade him to command them. He was most unwilling to do so. His wife had just given birth to a child, relatives had arrived for the baptism, and his only desire was to remain quietly on his estate in the bosom of his family. He addressed the peasants from the balcony. "My children, what have you done? How can you possibly hope to resist the troops of the Republic?" He pointed out the irreparable harm that a civil war would cause, and stressed that they were men with no military experience who would be opposed by regular soldiers. He sent them home to their wives and children, telling them to think of their families, to reconsider their stand, and to come back only if they were truly prepared to die for their cause. The next day, even more men, a huge crowd, appeared at d'Elbée's chateau, insisting upon their willingness to fight and die. When he found that the peasants could not be shaken from their purpose, he made them promise to act as men of resolution and stout heart, and never to lay down their arms until they had cast off the yoke of the Republic. Then forthwith he led them to the town of Beaucréau. His first task was to ensure that no harm came to the Republican prisoners, one of whom later described d'Elbée as a friend of humanity who never shed blood unnecessarily and was always opposed to the murder of prisoners. But on the 11th of April 1793, it seemed there was nothing that d'Elbée could do. His men were determined to make the blue prisoners pay for the massacre at Barret. 500 of these prisoners were held inside the church of Saint-Pierre at Chemier. d'Elbée stood on the steps of the church, interposing himself between his men and the prisoners. He pointed out that if Catholics behaved as brutally as Republicans, they might just as well be Republicans. He begged the peasants to show mercy, but they replied that no mercy had been shown at Barret. As a last resort, D'Elbée begged his men to at least kneel down and say one Pater Noster before carrying out their dreadful resolution. The peasants removed their hats and knelt down. When they reached the words, "Forgive us our trespasses," D'Elbée ordered them to stop. "Do you dare to mention God?" he cried. "You are asking him to forgive you in the same way that you pardon others." The lesson was obvious to the Catholic peasants. 500 blue prisoners were saved. And a few days ago, Dr. Tomba and I were standing on the very steps where D'Elbée stood to say this famous Pater. It's called the Pater of D'Elbée. After the death of Catalino, D'Elbée was appointed Generalissimo of the Catholic and Royal Army in July 1793. He was badly wounded at the Battle of Cholet on the 17th of October 1793, when a Vendéan army of 35,000 men was defeated in a ferocious battle by a Republican army of 32,000 elite regular troops. The Republican General Kléber, who came from Alsace, paid a tribute to the courage of the Vendéans, who fought, he said, like tigers. D'Elbée received 13 wounds from which he did not recover. When he was captured by the Blues on the island of Noirmoutier in January 1794, he was still too weak to stand. On the 7th of January, displaying the courage expected of a Vendéan general, Maurice Gigost D'Elbée faced the firing squad seated upon an armchair, which can still be seen in the museum of the nearby chateau. On the 10th of March 1793, it was announced that as not a single volunteer for the Republican Army had been forthcoming from the district of Saint-Florent-l'Évêché, lots would be drawn on Tuesday, the 12th of March. When Tuesday came, the town was invaded by 2,000 armed peasants wearing the right royalist cockades in their hats. They were opposed by only a handful of gendarmes and 200 poorly armed National Guardsmen. Spokesmen for the peasants, the mayors of Saint-Florent and 2 neighbouring towns, demanded that there should be no drawing of lots and that the Republican troops should lay down their arms. Republican speakers opposed the proposal. A shot rang out and a Republican speaker fell mortally wounded. The National Guard opened fire on the crowd, killing or wounding almost 40 of them. The enraged peasants fell upon the guards, crying, "Vive le roi!" and "Vive les prêtres!" long live the priests. The Republican officials joined the flight, and triumphant peasants first looted and then burned their offices. The guardsmen panicked, threw down their weapons, and fled. The die had been cast. What they now needed was someone to lead them, and there could be only one possibility: Artus, Marquis de Bonchamp. The Marquis had served as an officer in India, rising to the rank of major in the Régiment d'Aquitaine. He refused to take the oath of loyalty to the convention, resigned his commission, retired from the army in 1789, and went to live at the chateau of La Baronnière near Saint-Florent-l'Évêché. On the 13th of March 1793, Bonchamp reluctantly agreed to lead the peasants of his district. He warned them of the consequences of going to war against the Republican government, but they were adamant. Bonchamp was recognized as an outstanding general even by the Republicans, but he is best remembered for his famous pardon. Like D'Elbée, he was wounded at the Battle of Cholet. In Bonchamp's case, the wound was fatal. The defeated Vendéans retreated across the Loire with artillery, ox carts, and animals. The crossing, which began on the night of the 17th of October 1793 and lasted 48 hours, was almost miraculous. Some years later, Napoleon expressed his astonishment at the scale of the achievement. 80,000 made the crossing, of whom less than half were fighting men. The rest were women, children, old men, and prisoners, 5,000 of them. It was evidently impossible to keep these prisoners during the retreat because, apart from anything else, there was a grave shortage of food. What was to be done with them? The answer was simple and certain. They must be shot. The Catholic soldiers were embittered by their defeat, heartbroken at the news that their beloved general was on his deathbed, and outraged at incessant Republican atrocities. There can have been hardly a single Vendéan who had not lost friends, relations, or family at the hands of the brutal invaders. Furthermore, if the Blues were released, they would soon be rearmed and in the field once more. Not to shoot them would be folly. The dying Bonchamp had been ferried across the Loire and taken to Saint-Florent-l'Évêché, where he spent his last hours in the house of Jean Bellion, and this house can still be seen today. He received the news of the intended massacre of the prisoners with horror. The dying general received the last sacraments from his friend, the Abbé Courgeon, curé of La Chapelle Saint-Florent. His final words were, "I dare to put my trust in God's mercy. I have not fought for human glory. I have not succeeded in restoring the altars and the throne, but I have at least defended them. I have served my God, my king, and my country. I have known how to pardon." Bonchamp died shortly before midnight on the 18th of October, 1793. The Republican generals were astonished when they found that in obedience to his orders, their men had been released. They also had the problem of prisoners who had become an encumbrance to them. 29 cartloads of wounded Catholic soldiers. They solved the problem by throwing them all, while still alive, into a reservoir at Viziers. The Abbey Church of Saint-Florent contains the mausoleum of Bonchamp, which was declared an historic monument in 1825. The reason is that it is one of the masterpieces of Pierre-Jean David, called David d'Angers, one of the very greatest of all French sculptors. His most celebrated work is the pediment of the Panthéon in Paris. The statue of Bonchamp, in David's unmistakable classical style, depicts the dying general in his final agony, dressed in a Roman toga, demanding mercy for the prisoners. Why did this famous sculptor, a convinced Republican, decide to carve a monument to a Vendéan general? The answer is that his father was one of the prisoners whose life was saved by Bonchamp. Bonchamp's final order had been, "Grâce aux prisonniers, Bonchamp le veut, Bonchamp l'ordonne." Mercy for the prisoners. Bonchamp wishes it, Bonchamp orders it. And on the tomb they have the words, "Grâce aux prisonniers." I have a little postcard of that. Oh, here it is, which I'll pass around. Oops, sorry. Right. Still going, I hope. Yeah. Yes. Now I'd like to say a few words. Oops. Go ahead. Right. I'd like to say a few words about the Catholic and Royal Army. It's more accurate to speak of Vendéan armies rather than a single Vendéan army. The peasants owed their first loyalty to their particular leader, to Catalino, Delbé, Charat, or Monsieur Henri. Each army was composed of men from the same locality, the same village, the same family. Every parish had its own banner, usually a processional banner depicting our Lord, Our Lady, or some local saint. Attempts to adopt a uniform, even for a local army, were never very successful. Even the generals tended towards idiosyncrasy. The distinctive signs of the Catholic soldier, with a long rosary which hung around his neck, the Sacred Heart badge pinned upon his coat, and the white cockade attached to his hat. The Catholics were referred to as the Whites, in contrast to the Republican Blues. The great advantage possessed by the Catholic army was its knowledge of the countryside. Their marksmen hid behind hedges, in ditches, in sunken roads, on banks. These marksmen were expert shots as a result of years' experience in hunting. They did not fire volleys in the traditional military style. Each man waited for a target and took individual aim. Almost every shot that was fired found its mark. Blues by the dozen would fall without even knowing where the balls that killed them came from. When reproached for his defeat at the Battle of Torfu, the Republican General Kleber replied, "It is easy for you to talk, but those devils in sabots, that's clogs, those devils in sabots fight as well as we do and shoot better." When the Blues counterattacked, the Whites might disappear into the countryside, to appear again a few miles down the road. They would eventually attack, crying, "Vive la religion, vive le roi," and a ferocious hand-to-hand combat would ensue. In pitched battles, they would employ the tactic known as le grand choc, the great shock or charge. Instead of advancing upon the enemy in disciplined ranks, they would break ranks and fling themselves upon the enemy, screaming out their battle cry of "Romba, Romba." It is hardly surprising that the Republicans sometimes fled without resistance at what seemed to be a vast tide of steel sweeping towards them. Battles in which this tactic was employed were referred to by the Vendéans as shock, the most famous being the Grand Choc of Chaumières on the 11th of April, 1793. The great weakness of the Catholic army was its lack of discipline, its tendency to drift back home after a victory. The Catholic and Royal Army sometimes numbered as many as 80,000 men, but within 2 or 3 days of a victory, the vast majority might have returned home. The soldiers had farms to manage and families to feed. They felt obliged to hurry back to them after a successful battle. They would say to their commanders, "Je dois changer ma chemise," I must change my shirt, meaning I have to go back to my family for a while. It would be confusing to go through the long list of battles, some of which the Vendéens won and some of which they lost, but mention must be made of the attempt to capture the key city of Nantes, which they could have taken easily earlier in the campaign. On the 29th of June 1793, a concerted attack was made by 4 Catholic armies, but they were fighting outside their natural environment, engaged in formal warfare against professional soldiers defending a well-fortified city. There was also a lack of coordination among the 4 armies, in which personal rivalries may have played a part. The attack was repulsed, which was not in itself a disaster, as the armies retreated in good order. But what was a disaster was the fact that Catalino, the Saint of Anjou, generalissimo of the Catholic and Royal Army, was fatally wounded. He died at Saint-Florent-l'Évêché on the 14th of July 1793, aged 34 years. The loss of the leader, who had done more than any other individual to build up what had become known as the Army of the Sacred Heart, had a devastating effect upon the morale of his followers. The elite troops of the Republican Army were an invincible force of 20,000 battle-hardened veterans known as the Mayensais. They were all professional soldiers who had previously fought in the French Royal Army. They had captured the electorate of Mainz, or Mayence in Germany, during the campaign of 1792, and had won well-deserved glory in defending it against the Prussian army in July 1793. Although eventually obliged to capitulate, these tough soldiers had been granted the honours of war by the Prussians and were repatriated on condition that they did not fight in the line again for 1 year. The National Convention, which had replaced the General Assembly, wished to end the war in the Vendée as quickly as possible, and decided that the most effective means of doing so would be to send in the invincible Mayensais, under the command of General Jean-Baptiste Kleber, who had commanded them at Mainz. The regiment arrived in Nantes on the 5th of September 1793. On the 19th of September, they confronted the Catholic and Royal Army at Torfou. Kleber left half his men in reserve and attacked the town with 2 battalions. It was defended by the Pédrés of Charette. The Pédrés were peasants who came from the district called the Pays de Retz, and they're very, very proud of coming from that area. They consider themselves superior not just to the people of the Vendée, but to everyone in France. And they were referred to as the Pédrés. The Pédrés repulsed the Blues with devastatingly accurate fire from windows, doorways, rooftops, and breaches in the walls. Kleber sent in reinforcements supported by artillery. The town was soon in flames, but the Pédrés retreated in good order and continued to decimate the ranks of the Blues from behind every form of natural cover, trees, hedges, banks, and innumerable gorse bushes. Kleber refused to be withstood. He called in more reserves, and in the standard military formation of the period, the entire Mayensais army advanced in disciplined waves with fixed bayonets, singing the Marseillaise in step to the beating of their drums, and led by their brave general. It must have been a magnificent sight, rather like when you see Pickett's charge in Gettysburg. They got the heading lines of the drums beating. The result was irresistible. Despite their habitual bravery, the Pédrés broke and fled. Mounted on his horse, waving his plumed hat, Charette did all in his power to rally them, but the rout was complete. The Pédrés had no thought in mind beyond reaching the bridge over the river Sèvre. But when they did so, they encountered a force which terrified them far more than the Mayensais. They met their wives. The women were praying at a calvary near the bridge. All through the Vendée today you see these calvaries, these large stone crucifixes. The women were praying at a calvary near the bridge when their fleeing menfolk appeared. They were outraged by what they considered to be their cowardice, not knowing that for hours their husbands had withstood the finest troops in the French army, who vastly outnumbered them. The women blocked the path of the fugitives, then flung themselves upon the men, attacking them verbally and physically. The men were accused of being shameless, of not being men at all. They were stoned, struck with sticks, and their weapons torn from their hands. If the men were not concerned with the honour of the Pays de Retz, the women were. They would go and fight in place of their men. The Pédrés had no choice. At once, as one man, they turned and made for Torfou. Kleber had imagined that he only had Charette to deal with, but when the Pédrés fled, the battle seemed to be over. Then, to his dismay, the army of Anjou, the Angevins, led by Bonchamp, arrived. It was the Grand Shock to end all Grand Shocks. Although wounded, Beauchamp insisted upon leaving his stretcher to fight with his men. Now that dirty scoundrel Beauchamp has arrived, snarled Kleber, we are completely... his comment was unprintable, but he meant things are difficult for us. So as he said, now that dirty scoundrel Beauchamp has arrived, we are completely... Beep! Right. D'Elbée also led his troops into the attack, as did the Marquis de Lescure. Charette and the Pedres returned. Kleber's army was engulfed in a tide of Vendeans. Kleber made heroic efforts to rally his men, waving his tricolour beplumed hat in the manner of Charette. One historian of the war remarked, each hero was worthy of the other, but his efforts were fruitless. The Mayensais, who had retreated before no army in Europe, were forced to leave the field. Some accounts claim that they fled in panic, throwing away their weapons. Others, that they retreated in good order, kneeling and firing volleys every 30 paces. The amount of booty taken by the Vendeans was enormous. Cannon, mortars, ammunition wagons, Republican money. But where the Vendeans were concerned, only one thing mattered. The invincible Mayensais had been routed, and they had routed them. François-Joseph Westermann, known as the Butcher of the Vendée, like Kleber, was also a native of the Alsace. He came from a noble and very Catholic family, but became a ferocious revolutionary and a disciple of Danton. Westermann won what proved to be the decisive battle of the war at Savigny on the 23rd of December 1793. The Catholics were outnumbered by 4 to 1. Time and again they attacked the Blue Battalions in heroic but hopeless charges. As many as 6,000 Catholic prisoners were massacred after the battle. Many of them were women, of whom a great number carried babies in their wombs. One wonders how anyone raised as a Catholic could have written the gloating report that Westermann sent to the Committee of Public Safety in Paris. This is what he wrote. The Vendée no longer exists. It died beneath our sabres, with its women and its children. I have buried it in the swamps and woods of Savigny. I crushed the children beneath the hooves of my horses and massacred the women. I do not have one prisoner to reproach myself with. I have exterminated them all. The roads are littered with corpses. Kleber and Marceau were not there. We took no prisoners. It was necessary to feed them with the bread of liberty. And pity is not a revolutionary sentiment. Westermann cannot have realized how true these words were, and when Danton fell in 1794, Westermann followed his mentor to the guillotine. Pity is indeed not a revolutionary sentiment. After Savigny, the Catholic and Royal Army had ceased to exist, but Westermann was premature in stating that the Vendée no longer existed. In the west of the country, there were still men willing to give their lives for religion and the king, despite the terrible price that had been paid. 50,000 Catholics and as many Republicans had already died. Scarcely one peasant out of every 10 who left his village to fight for religion, and the good king returned. Now I want to tell you about the Infernal Columns, which is a really terrible story. It's reputed to be the first organized act of genocide in the history of the world. The terror unleashed upon the Catholics of the Vendée was certainly unparalleled until the advent of Stalin and Hitler. It was the ultimate manifestation of Saint-Just dictum was that the Republic consists of the extermination of everything which opposes it. This policy was carried out throughout the whole Vendée. The prisoners were just massacred everywhere without mercy. Thousands of prisoners were captured and put in the prisons of the city of Nantes. And these prisons were almost literally bursting with Catholics. They all had 3 or 4 times the number for which they'd been built. The squalor and the suffering this caused cannot be imagined. Old and young, men and women and children were all crammed together in conditions devoid of the minimum requirements of decency, sanitation or hygiene. Epidemics caused hundreds of deaths each day. Some bodies were thrown into the River Loire. Others were left in the prison cells to decompose among the barely living. Republican doctors who visited the prison made known their horror at what they found. The Republican excuse was that the guillotine could not eliminate the enemies of liberty at a sufficiently swift and economic rate. I mentioned to you this morning about the representatives on mission who were sent throughout the country to implement the revolution, and the bestial Jean-Baptiste Carrier was appointed representative on mission at Nantes on the 23rd of September 1793. and was invested with powers which gave him carte blanche to adopt any measures that he saw fit to deal with counter-revolutionaries. The measure that he saw fit to overcome the problem of prison overcrowding was to initiate the notorious drownings of Nantes, les noyades de Nantes. Prisoners, tied together in pairs, were placed in flat-bottomed barges. Holes were drilled in the sides and boarded over until the barges reached the middle of the river, when the executioner boatmen would remove the boards and jump into boats that were alongside, from which they watched their victims drown. These drownings were at first confined to priests and carried out surreptitiously at night, beginning with 90 priests on the 19th of November 1793. But they soon took place in broad daylight and were regarded as a form of public entertainment. At least 5,000 Catholics, priests, old men, young men, women and children were tied together 2 by 2, taken out into the River Loire in boatloads and drowned. The most depraved refinement of the drownings was the so-called mariage républicain, the Republican marriage, in which a man and a woman would be stripped naked, tied together, ridiculed and then thrown into the Loire. There could hardly have been a more sadistic way to humiliate devout Catholics. The Loire was referred to by Republican humorists as the baignoire nationale, the national swimming pool, and the drownings were termed baptême patriotique, patriotic baptisms. Republicans remarked that even though the brigands, they referred to the Catholics as brigands, even though the brigands had complained while in prison that they were dying of hunger, those placed in the barges could hardly complain that they were dying of thirst. Carrier objected to trials as a waste of time. The very fact of being arrested must be considered proof of guilt. All these suspects, he commanded a judge, must be eliminated in a couple of hours, or I will have you and your colleagues shot. Carrier himself perished on the guillotine in December 1794, 2 months after the fall of Robespierre. The conventions decided that the Vendéens must be exterminated and every trace of their ever having existed eradicated from the face of the earth. And they did this, as I mentioned, by the infernal columns. General Turreau, yet another aristocrat who had embraced the revolution, was sent to the Vendée in January 1794 with these infernal columns. He referred to the Vendéens contemptuously as soldiers of Jesus. His assignment was to kill every living human being, irrespective of sex or age, and to burn and destroy every sign of human habitation. Turreau commanded 6 divisions, and each division was divided into 2 columns, and the commanders of the columns vied with each other in their sadism and their violence. Even citizens who were known to be Republicans were referred to as patriots. Even citizens known to be Republicans who were found in Catholic villages were not to be spared. An order of the day read, "I order you to burn all that can be burned, and to bayonet every human being that you encounter." I know that there are some patriots in this country, but it cannot be helped. We must sacrifice everything. There was no level of brutality to which the infernal columns did not descend. Orders were given to conserve powder by killing with the saber rather than the gun. Women were raped as a matter of routine. Children were butchered and the bodies mutilated. Soldiers would tear unborn babies from the wombs of their mothers and carry them in triumph, still living on the points of their bayonets. Babies were taken from their cradles and cut in 2 with one blow of a saber. Women and children were thrown alive into a red-hot furnace. At Parc-sous-Birs near Mouchon, the chateau was burned to the ground, as were all the chateaux in the path of the infernal columns. 250 villagers were shot there, irrespective of age and sex. The bodies burned on a huge pyre and then thrown into a well of the chateau. At Gonard, 200 mothers, children and old people were forced to dig a trench into which they tumbled as they were shot. At least 30 women and 2 children were still living when the trench was filled with earth. Every form of food was destroyed. Crops in the field, grain in barns, animals in their sheds. Any Catholic who escaped the columns was intended to die a lingering death from starvation. Needless to say, every church in the path of the columns was first profaned and then looted. The date of the 28th of February 1794 is particularly notorious in the history of the Revolution for the massacre of Les Lucs, 2 villages, Le Grand Luc, the Big Luc, and Le Petit Luc, the Little Luc. All the inhabitants of both villages and the surrounding hamlets were systematically butchered. Hundreds fled to take refuge in the church of Le Petit Luc. Those who could not enter knelt outside praying the rosary. The 70-year-old curé, the Abbé Voineau, like a true good shepherd, interposed himself between the blues and his flock, appealing to whatever vestige of humanity might remain in these monsters. They tortured him and then murdered him in the sight of his parishioners. The blues then fired upon the church and on those outside with their cannon. The church collapsed upon the dead, the dying, and the wounded. 564 Catholics died that day, of whom 110 were children of less than 7 years of age. A true massacre of the innocents at Bethlehem in the Vendée. All the atrocities that I've described so far were perpetrated in the name of liberty, equality, and most ironic of all, fraternity. And a few weeks ago I was present with Tom and Dr. Bob in the church of Le Petit Luc, where you can go and see, and they have a list of all these people who were murdered in this massacre. You'll see families like say, Monsieur Bonchamp, age 47, Madame Louise Bonchamp, age 45, Denise Bonchamp, age 17, Charles Bonchamp, age 13, Marie Bonchamp, age 9, and then you see perhaps, where Robert Bonchamp, 4 days old. And they're all there in plaques on the wall. I've got a photograph you can see a little later if you like to that Dr. Bob took. The infernal columns were intended to break the spirit of the Vendéens, but they had precisely the opposite effect. Most of the leaders of the Vendéens had retreated with small groups of followers into the interior of the Vendée. Although they were no longer in a position to mount assaults on towns or cities, they were able to act very effectively as guerrillas. Shots would ring out from nowhere, soldiers from a column would fall wounded or dead, and those who shot them would not be seen and could not be found. When the blues lay down to sleep at night, they did not know whether they would live to see the morning. Charette was particularly active. Success increased the numbers of his men, and an entire infernal column was routed. But there was no more talk of mercy for prisoners or the wounded. Hymns and the rosary were no longer heard. The Catholic soldiers were motivated by a cold fury and the desire for revenge. In a daring raid upon the town of Chemillé, another Vendéen general, Monsieur Henry, put 600 Republican troops to flight and liberated 600 women who were on the point of being shot. The principal target of the Republicans was now Charette. General Haxo was sent with 20,000 well-armed men to apprehend him. Haxo promised the Committee of Public Safety that, in 6 weeks, I will send you the head of Charette, or I will lose my own. On the 20th of March 1794, Haxo divided his forces into 4 columns and attacked the much smaller force of Charette. The Catholics fell upon the blues with a terrible fury and drove them back. Haxo, a brave and skillful soldier, rallied his men and counterattacked on 6 occasions, but eventually fell wounded from his horse. He struggled to his feet, put his back to a tree, and with drawn sword and great courage, he faced the Catholics who surrounded him. Haxo was killed without mercy. Charette remarked, "How sad to have killed so brave a man," and he wept. Haxo, the pride of the Republicans, was buried where he fell. In the autumn of 1794, with a force that rarely numbered more than 700 men, Charette won a series of brilliant victories. He became known as the King of the Vendée, and the convention was furious. The tactic of the infernal columns had not achieved its objectives and was abandoned. An attempt was made at conciliation. An amnesty was offered to all who had laid down their arms, with the exception of the non-juring priests. 900 prisoners were liberated at Nantes, 83 at Saumur, and 50 at Angers and Rochefort. Republican delegates made contact with the Vendéen leaders. All that they needed to do, the Republicans said, was to recognize the Republic, and everything could be arranged. The kings of Europe have now recognized the Republic, Charette was assured, and he replied, "That may be true, but they are not Vendéens." The Republican General Hoche was given command of all the Republican forces in the Vendée. Hoche was a prudent man, and he was determined to get a lasting peace, and he was wise enough to realize that this could best be done through the non-juring priests. He explained to his officers, "As priests, their nature is naturally inclined towards peace. With a little tact, we can use them as a means of pacifying the region. Send officers and soldiers to assist their masses. When you meet the peasants, speak to them reverently of God. The Republican generals followed these orders, and some of the soldiers even went to the extent of helping the non-juring priests to repair and reopen their churches. What a paradox of history! The very soldiers who had been torturing priests and profaning tabernacles a few months before were now behaving as if they were faithful Catholics. Some even acted as sacristans, but the tactic worked. The non-juring priests continued to refuse to take the oath of loyalty to the Republic, but they no longer preached against it. The new policy of religious tolerance was not confined to the Vendée. But what must be understood here, though, was that Hoche wasn't doing this for any kind of humanitarian reason. It was simply to get peace so that his troops could be taken to fight the external enemies of France. Whether they were aware of it or not, Catholics in Paris and throughout France ordered the restoration of their right to public worship to the martyrs of the Vendée. The Catholic revival gained such momentum throughout the whole of France that by the end of 1796, the Republican General Clark lamented, "Our revolution, so far as religion is concerned, has proved a complete failure. France has become once more Roman Catholic." Simon Scarm in his book remarks that the Enlightenment cliché of a steadily secularizing France completely fails to take account of just how deeply rooted the hold of Christian belief was in very large areas of France. Of all the failures of the French Revolution, none would be so inevitable and so dismissal as the campaign of de-Christianization. Hoche had pacified the Vendée with one exception, Charette, and it was essential to eliminate him, cost what it may. Hoche's program of conciliation was proving so successful that only 1,000 men remained with Charette. "Surrender your arms," urged Hoche. "Rebuild your homes, cultivate your farms, pray to God. You will be left in peace." This was tempting advice, particularly because it was evident that Hoche meant what he said. He meant it not from any sympathy with the Vendéan cause, but because peace in the Vendée was essential for the Republican cause. The deciding factors where most of the peasants were concerned was the advice of their good priests, the non-jurors, to abandon the armed struggle. But under no circumstances was Charette willing to allow Hoche to consider him a spent force. He made a series of daring attacks upon the Blues, and to the consternation of Hoche, Charette was victorious on each occasion. Although these victories were gained in what were no more than skirmishes, it was no less galling for the Republican general. On the 4th of December, Charette made a successful attack upon a Republican camp and won his final victory. Hoche was no longer willing to negotiate with him. Secure in the knowledge that his policy of conciliation had ruled out any possibility of a further popular rising, he decided to track down the King of the Vendée and eliminate him. With each day that passed, Charette's faithful remnant dwindled to 300 and then to 200. They were hounded unceasingly by the Blues. Hoche decided that after all, he would make one more attempt to negotiate a settlement. If Charette agreed to leave the Vendée, his life would be spared. Charette replied, "I shall conquer or die for my God and my King. That is my resolve. It will never change." Hoche now devoted all his energies to hunting down Charette. In his divisional orders he wrote, "Give him no rest. Use any form of deceit, but arrest Charette." Only a pitiful remnant of his supporters now remained with the King of the Vendée. They numbered no more than a few dozen. In a skirmish on the 8th of March 1796, they lost their remaining horses. Weakened by hunger and fatigue, drenched by ceaseless rain, frozen to the marrow, thin, foul-smelling, they struggled along paths of ankle-deep mud, which made every step a painful effort. Hoche had withdrawn 4 columns of his best troops from every duty but hunting down Charette. On the 23rd of March, Charette and his remaining handful of followers were hemmed in by 3 of the columns, but Charette would still not surrender. They fought throughout the day, their numbers dwindling as the Blues picked them off one by one. Charette's faithful bodyguard, Pfeiffer, received a fatal wound. He cried out as he died, "I am Charette!" The Blues were not deceived, and the pursuit intensified. Charette was now completely trapped in a forest. Again and again he tried to find a way out that was not guarded, but it was of no avail. The Blues came upon him at last and opened fire immediately. A musket ball lodged in his shoulder, but he continued to fight. A blue officer slashed at him with his sword and cut 3 fingers from his left hand. "Where is Charette?" the officer demanded. "He is here," was the reply. Charette had been taken. He was taken to the Château of La Charbotterie and laid upon the kitchen table for attention to his wounds. The Catholic general was to be shot, and he must not be allowed to die before his execution. The table upon which he lay can be seen today in the kitchen of La Charbotterie, which is now part museum and part shrine to the heroes of the Vendée. And once again, Dr. Bob and Tom and I were there a few weeks ago, and we saw this table. Charette was taken to Angers and was received with great courtesy by General Edouville, who asked why he took up arms when the Republic had offered peace. And he said because the Republic could not be trusted to keep its promises. Posters were printed announcing that Charette had been captured. He was taken to Nantes on the 28th of March and paraded through the streets to convince the inhabitants that he really had been taken. On the same day he was condemned to be shot, and the sentence was carried out. He asked for a non-juring priest to hear his confession, but the request was refused. He was, however, promised that on his way to execution he would see a priest who was a friend. Charette made a 2-hour confession to a juring priest, the Abbé Guibert, who accompanied him to his execution. The non-juring priest, l'Abbé Gergaud, was on the route as promised. Charette paused before him, bowed his head, and received his absolution. There's a beautiful picture of that done by Tom in my book. When Charette arrived at the place of execution, he embraced his confessor, recited an act of contrition aloud, refused a blindfold, and said that he would give the sign to fire himself by lowering his head. Charette stood to attention, his head held high. Pointing to his heart, he called out to the picket, "Soldiers, aim there! It is here that you must strike the heart of a brave man. Vive le roi!" Slowly and deliberately he lowered his head. A moment's pause. A volley rang out. He received 5 balls in the chest, remained upright for a moment, and then slid slowly to the ground. The Chevalier François Athanase Charette de la Contrie, General of the Catholic and Royal Army, was dead. He was 33 years old. The sacrifices made by the Vendéens brought freedom to the church throughout France. These sacrifices had been enormous and had been borne by every section of Vendéen society, from the very old to unborn babies in the womb. The historian Renaud Séché has termed the Republican reprisals as an act of genocide. Between 250,000 and 300,000 Vendéens died, together with a vast number of Republican troops. The true extent of the Republican losses was never revealed. Not all the Vendéens who died were killed in the fighting or the massacres. Thousands died as a result of the hardship, penury, and epidemics resulting from the war. The granting of complete religious freedom for all French Catholics was the final act in the last crusade, the War of the Giants. It was Napoleon himself who had described the Vendéens as such. They were giants who saved the honor of Catholic France. They were giants whose enormous sacrifices show the extent to which every Catholic should go to uphold his faith, to the very limit and beyond. They were giants who realized that the only victory that matters is that of doing what we know to be right, cost what it may. The last words of Bonchamp, which I've already quoted to you, should inspire every Catholic who loves the faith to emulate him. I have not fought for human glory, I have not succeeded in restoring the altars and the throne, but I have at least defended them.